When they threatened his daughter, they made the last mistake of their lives. The fire door had fresh scratches around its lock. The security camera above Elara Wycliffe's private elevator had been rotated 3 degrees, not broken, repositioned. And the maintenance worker crossing the lobby wore an access badge with a photograph of a man 20 years older than him. Ronan Hale saw all 3 things in the first 11 minutes of his facility tour. He was wearing boots that needed resoling. His 7-year-old daughter was holding his hand because the babysitter had canceled that morning. The other security candidates in pressed suits were pretending not to laugh. None of them saw what he saw. None of them understood what it meant. Someone inside Asterion Dynamics was already in position. And the woman standing at the front of that tour group, 30 years old, composed as carved marble, worth $4 billion on paper, had no idea her company had already been turned against her. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to our channel and follow every part of this story through to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching right now. We want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. It only gets more intense from here. The morning Ronan Hale drove to his interview at Asterion Dynamics, the truck made a sound it hadn't made before, a low metallic complaint from somewhere under the hood that he filed away for later and chose not to think about. He had learned that skill in the Navy, triage. Decide what matters right now and let everything else wait. What mattered right now was the interview. Tessa sat in the passenger seat eating a granola bar and reading a library book about horses, her feet dangling well above the floor mat. She was 7, small for her age, with dark eyes that cataloged everything quietly. A habit she'd picked up from him, or maybe she'd always had it, and he'd simply recognized himself. "Are there horses there?" she asked without looking up from the book. "It's an aerospace company. They build aircraft. So no horses. No horses." She turned a page. "That's disappointing." Ronan had told her the babysitter was sick. The truth was that Mrs. Paulson had canceled 40 minutes before the interview with a text message that read, "Family thing. So sorry," and nothing more, and he hadn't had time to find anyone else. He'd spent 15 minutes sitting at the kitchen table calculating his options before he decided there was only one. He would bring Tessa and deal with whatever that cost him. He'd learned that in the Navy too. When the plan fails, you work with what you have. The Asterion Dynamics headquarters sat on the northern edge of the city's industrial corridor, a complex of glass and steel and high fencing that managed to look both modern and sealed, the way facilities always looked when the people inside them were serious about what happened inside them. Ronan had studied the company's public profile the night before. Aerospace defense systems, government contracts, a CEO who had taken over at 28 after her predecessor resigned under circumstances the press called strategic differences, and that almost certainly meant something uglier. He parked in visitor spaces and walked Tessa toward the main entrance. The other candidates were already gathered near the lobby security desk. Ronan counted 5 of them, 4 men and 1 woman, all in suits that had been recently pressed, shoes that caught the light. One of the men glanced at Tessa and then at Ronan's boots, and his expression moved through amusement too quickly for him to catch it, but not quickly enough. Ronan had spent years reading rooms full of people who wanted to kill him. Reading a lobby full of people who thought he didn't belong was not a significant challenge. He signed in at the desk. Tessa stood beside him and studied the lobby with the focused attention of someone who had been told to stay quiet and was choosing to make the most of it. "Cool ceiling," she whispered. He looked up. The atrium extended 3 stories, all glass and steel framing. "Yeah," he agreed. "It looks like a greenhouse, but for people." A woman in a charcoal blazer appeared from the far side of the lobby and introduced herself as Director of Human Resources. She gave Tessa a brief, slightly uncertain smile, the kind adults gave children they hadn't expected and weren't sure what to do with, then addressed the group and explained that they would begin with a tour of the public access areas of the facility before individual interviews. Ronan listened. He also started working. Not visibly. He learned early that the most dangerous thing you could do in a sensitive environment was look like you were studying it. So he kept his expression neutral, kept his posture relaxed, kept one hand near Tessa's shoulder, and let his eyes do the work quietly. The lobby was clean, access points well marked, cameras positioned at standard angles covering the main entrance and reception desk. Nothing unusual. First corridor, offices, meeting rooms. The kind of institutional carpeting that absorbed sound and made people feel slightly more comfortable than they should. A fire door at the far end had a standard push bar and a magnetic seal indicator, light glowing green. Except the paint around the lock cylinder had fine parallel scratches that weren't there from regular use. Those scratches came from something probing the mechanism. Someone had tested that door from the outside, or been practicing opening it from the outside, and not long ago, because the scratches still looked bright against the older paint. Ronan said nothing. Second area? The executive floor atrium, viewed from a mezzanine level. Elara Wycliffe's office occupied the northwest corner. Her private elevator was visible from where they stood. The camera above the elevator doors was mounted on a standard bracket. Ronan had read enough facility security specs to know the camera's field of view should have centered on the elevator itself and approximately 6 feet of corridor in each direction. But the lens was angled slightly, maybe 3 degrees off horizontal. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone running a casual inspection to notice. Enough that the elevator's immediate approach from the east corridor fell entirely outside its coverage. Someone had adjusted that camera. Manually, carefully, in a way that looked like factory positioning if you weren't measuring it against the frame. Tessa tugged his sleeve. "What?" he murmured. "Nothing." She pointed at a painting on the mezzanine wall. Abstract, enormous. "It looks like a horse if you tilt your head." He tilted his head slightly. It did not look like a horse. "Sure," he said. They moved on. The third observation took him another 4 minutes. The group was crossing a connecting corridor between the main building and a secondary wing when Ronan noticed the maintenance worker. Young, mid-20s maybe. Work clothes, tool belt, a clipboard that he held like he'd been told to carry a clipboard and had never carried one before. Standard enough. Except the access badge clipped to his shirt pocket had a small photograph on it, and the man in that photograph had gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes. That photograph was of someone who had been at Asterion long enough to earn deep lines. And the man wearing his badge was not that person. This happened. Badges got mixed up, shared between shifts, clipped onto the wrong shirt by accident in locker rooms. Ronan knew all the legitimate explanations. He also knew that a man using someone else's access badge was either careless or deliberate, and in a facility like this one, the distinction mattered enormously. He filed all 3 observations. Said nothing. Let the tour conclude. Individual interviews followed in a conference room with too much air conditioning. Ronan sat across from the HR director and a man introduced as the head of corporate security. Late 50s, the particular kind of watchful that came from law enforcement background rather than military, different rhythm to the way he held attention. They asked him about his employment gap. Everyone always asked about the employment gap. He told them what he always told people. He'd left federal service to care for his daughter after her mother passed. And he'd been out of the traditional workforce for 2 years while he focused on that. "What kind of federal service?" the security head asked. "The kind that didn't generate a lot of paperwork," Ronan said. A pause. The security head studied him with the look of someone running a calculation. "Your file came through a government contractor background check. Most of your service record is flagged classified." "Yes." "That tells me something." "I'd imagine it does," Ronan said. The interview moved on. He answered questions about security philosophy, threat assessment, protective protocols. He answered them correctly and without embellishment, because embellishment was what people did when they wanted to impress someone, and he wasn't interested in impressing these people. He was interested in the job. When they finished, the HR director asked if he had any questions. "One," he said. "The fire door at the end of Corridor B on the ground floor, when was it last inspected?" A beat of silence. The security head's expression changed slightly. "That's a specific question. The lock cylinder has fresh probe marks. Somebody's been testing it from the outside." He paused. "The camera above the executive elevator on the mezzanine level has also been manually repositioned to eliminate coverage of the east corridor approach. And there's a maintenance worker in the facility using an access badge with someone else's photograph on it." The room was very quiet. "I noticed all 3 in the first 40 minutes of the tour," Ronan said. "I thought you should know." The HR director looked at the security head. The security head looked at Ronan. "Stay here," he said, and left the room. Tessa, who had been sitting in the corner with her horse book and her granola bar wrapper, and a level of patience that sometimes astonished him, looked up. Is it going well? Hard to say. You look like it's going okay. I don't know what my face looks like right now. Calm, she said. You always look calm when things are actually serious. He looked at her. She went back to her book. He was still in that conference room 20 minutes later when the door opened again. Not the security head, not the HR director, but a woman in a charcoal gray jacket over a dark blouse. No jewelry, except a watch that cost more than his truck. Posture that said she was the person everyone else adjusted to rather than the other way around. Elara Wycliffe was 30 years old and had the quality of someone who had been managing other people's expectations of her since she was a teenager. She looked at Ronan. She looked at Tessa. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with the directness of someone who found preamble wasteful. You flagged 3 security anomalies during a 40-minute tour, she said. Yes. What you identified as probe marks on the fire door. My team confirmed them. The camera repositioning, also confirmed. The access badge issue is being investigated right now. She held his gaze. How do you notice things like that? Practice, he said. What kind of practice? The kind where missing it had consequences. She studied him for a moment. He'd been studied by people before, interrogators, commanders, enemies who were very good at their jobs. She was doing something different, not evaluating his training or his capability, evaluating whether she could trust what she was looking at. My security team does daily walkthroughs of this facility, she said. Nobody on that team flagged any of what you identified. I know. That concerns me. It should. Tessa looked up from her book. Is she the boss? Tessa, he said, it's a reasonable question. Elara Wycliffe looked at Tessa for a moment, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. Yes, she said. I am. Tessa nodded seriously. You have a really cool building, thank you. It looks like a greenhouse, but for people. I've never heard it described that way. Elara turned back to Ronan. Who else in your interview group noticed what you noticed? Nobody. You sound certain. I am. I was watching them during the tour. They were thinking about their interviews. He held her gaze. I was thinking about the building. Another silence, different from the others. The kind of silence that meant someone was making a decision. I have 3 other candidates with cleaner resumes and employment histories that don't have 2-year gaps in them, she said. And your file is 70% classified. Yes. Why should I hire you instead of one of them? He considered the question carefully, not how to answer it persuasively, but how to answer it honestly. Because someone inside this building has already spent time preparing to get to you, he said, and you need someone who notices that before they make their next move, not after. Elara Wycliffe said nothing for a moment. Then, what do you mean, get to me? The access badge. That's reconnaissance, testing who can go where without triggering alarms. The camera repositioning eliminates a blind spot near your private access point. The door probe means someone is studying entry routes that don't pass through monitored checkpoints. He leaned forward slightly. These aren't random security lapses. They're coordinated preparation. Whoever is doing this isn't interested in the building. They're interested in you, and they've already gotten further than they should have. The quality of the silence in the room changed completely. Elara Wycliffe looked at him for a long time. Then she stood. My assistant will provide you with paperwork. Don't go far. She moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. Your daughter. She's perceptive. She is, he agreed. Must run in the family, Elara said, and left. Tessa waited until the door had closed completely. I like her, she said. Ronan exhaled slowly. You met her for 90 seconds. She answered my question seriously, Tessa said, as if this settled the matter. Adults don't always do that. He sat back in his chair. Through the conference room's window, he could see a sliver of the facility's outer courtyard, the fencing, the clean lines, the afternoon light cutting across the concrete. Somewhere in that building, a man was walking around with someone else's badge, and somewhere in the infrastructure of this corporation. A camera had been moved 3 degrees from where it should be, and a door that should have been locked tight had the marks of someone practicing their way through it. He thought, they've already started. He thought, which means they think they have more time than they do. What he didn't think yet, what wouldn't occur to him until much later, when it was already too late to call it a surprise, was that they had noticed him too. The paperwork took 40 minutes, and Ronan signed most of it without reading it carefully, which was not something he made a habit of, but which he justified to himself on the grounds that the relevant details, salary, start date, scope of responsibilities, were either acceptable or they weren't, and he needed the job too much to negotiate over language. Tessa fell asleep on the drive home with her horsebook open across her lap, and her head tilted against the window at an angle that was going to give her a stiff neck, which she would complain about in the morning and then forget by breakfast. He drove with the windows cracked because the truck's cabin tended to get warm and because the sound of moving air helped him think. What he thought about was pattern. He'd spent years, the classified years, the ones that didn't generate paperwork, learning to read threat patterns the way other people read weather. You looked at individual signals, and you tried to resist the temptation to connect them too quickly, because confirmation bias was how good analysts got people killed. You held the data points separately, and you waited for the shape to emerge on its own. The shape emerging from Asterian dynamics was not ambiguous. The probe marks on the fire door, the repositioned camera, the borrowed access badge, 3 separate actions, 3 separate risks, all pointing toward the same object, Elara Wycliffe's daily movement through her own facility. Whoever was doing this wasn't reckless. They were methodical. They were building a picture. They were figuring out exactly how she moved, where the gaps were, which approach would give them access without being recorded. The word that kept surfacing was inside. This wasn't someone who had found a way into Asterian. This was someone already in. He pulled into the driveway of the house he rented, a narrow 2-bedroom in a neighborhood that had been working class 20 years ago and was now caught in the slow transition toward something more expensive, which meant his landlord was patient with him for now, but wouldn't be forever. He carried Tessa inside without waking her, put her in bed still wearing her shoes because removing them would wake her, and she needed the sleep more than she needed clean sheets. And then he stood in the kitchen for a while and drank water and let the day settle into something he could organize. His first day wasn't until Monday. It was Thursday evening. The gap bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He started Monday at 7, 90 minutes before the security team's regular shift began, because arriving early to a new environment was not a preference. It was a way of learning how a place behaved when it thought nobody important was watching. The overnight security guard at the main desk was a heavy-set man named Earl, who looked like he'd been awake for 6 of his 8 hours, and was managing the remaining 2 through sheer conversational willpower. He talked to Ronan for 20 minutes while processing his credentials, covering topics including the coffee machine on the second floor that dispensed grounds instead of coffee at least twice a week, a parking dispute between 2 executives that had apparently been running for 3 months, and his nephew's recent decision to study marine biology, which Earl considered optimistic. Ronan listened to all of it and remembered the parts that were relevant, which was more of it than Earl would have expected. The security office was on the ground floor, behind a door marked with no sign, because the people who needed to know where it was already knew. Ronan had been assigned to protective detail, meaning Elara Wycliffe's immediate security rather than the broader facility team. And his direct superior in this arrangement was a man named Dale Pittman, who had been head of corporate security for 4 years and who communicated primarily through silences of varying duration. They shook hands. Dale's handshake was precise and brief. "You start with the morning walkthrough," Dale said. 7:30, you go through every access point on the executive floor, check the camera feeds, log anything irregular. Then you're on her from the moment she comes through that lobby until she leaves. You stay close, you stay quiet, and you don't interpret what you see. You report it. To you. You, Ronan said. To me. And if I see something that needs immediate action, then you take it and report it after. Dale looked at him steadily. But your threshold for what constitutes immediate action needs to match mine, not whatever you had in your previous work. What's yours? Credible, imminent physical threat. Everything else runs through me first. It was a reasonable protocol for a standard security operation. Ronan recognized that. He also recognized that the 3 things he'd spotted during the tour represented a level of operational preparation that had already moved past what Dale's protocol was designed to handle, and that saying so right now would accomplish nothing except making him appear difficult on his first morning. Understood, he said. Dale nodded. Something in his expression didn't fully close. The morning walkthrough took Ronan through the executive floor methodically. Each office, each corridor, each camera angle, the elevator, the stairwells, the emergency exits. He logged everything in the format Dale had shown him. He also, separately, and without noting it in the log, measured camera angles against what they should cover, checked door seals for fresh marks, and noted that the fire door in Corridor B now had a new lock cylinder. Someone had replaced it quickly after he'd flagged it, which was the right response, and also told him that whoever had been testing it would need to adjust their approach. They were adaptive. That was important to know. He found nothing new that morning, but absence of evidence in a situation like this was not the same as evidence of absence. It meant the people doing this were either pausing or had moved to a phase he hadn't mapped yet. Elara arrived at 8:47 in an armored SUV that was too large for the parking space she'd been assigned, which she navigated anyway with the practiced indifference of someone who had learned to operate large vehicles in tight spaces rather than wait for better circumstances. She walked through the lobby with two assistants matching her pace and a phone pressed between her ear and shoulder, listening more than talking. She acknowledged Ronan with a glance that was brief but complete, the kind of look that said, "I see you and I'm choosing to deal with you later." And he fell into position 3 steps behind her left shoulder and stayed there. The morning was meetings, an endless, compacted sequence of meetings. Ronan stood outside rooms and listened to nothing through closed doors and watched hallways and thought. He thought about the parking structure. Asterion's main building connected to a 7-story parking structure by an enclosed walkway on the 2nd floor. The structure had its own camera system and its own access control, and Elara used it every day. Arrived in her SUV, exited through the lobby side, reversed the route at night. It was her most predictable movement. Most predictable movements were also most accessible to someone studying her schedule. He looked at the camera feeds on his tablet that afternoon and found what he suspected he'd find. 2 cameras covering the parking structure's executive level had been subtly adjusted. Not repositioned like the elevator camera, something subtler. Their timestamps were running 4 minutes slow, which meant 4 minutes of what those cameras appeared to show was actually recorded footage from earlier, looping quietly over real time. He stood very still for a moment. Then he took screenshots, noted the time codes, and went to find Dale. Dale looked at the screenshots for a long moment. "You're saying someone hacked the camera system," he said. "I'm saying the timestamps don't match the building's master clock, and the discrepancy is the same on both cameras covering the executive parking level. 4 minutes of coverage on that level is effectively blind right now." He paused. "And it's been this way long enough that somebody had to test it at least once to confirm it was working." Dale set the tablet down. He had the expression of someone recalculating something they'd thought was already settled. "I'll get the IT security team on this." "How soon?" "Today. This afternoon." "Before she uses the parking structure tonight?" Another beat. "Yes," Dale said. "I'll make sure of it." Ronan went back to his post. He told himself that was enough, that he'd flagged it, that it was in the right hands, that the protocol existed for a reason. He almost believed it. Elara's last meeting ran until 7:15 in the evening. Ronan had been on his feet since 6:50 in the morning and had eaten half a sandwich at his desk at noon and a granola bar from his jacket pocket at 4 o'clock. He was not complaining about this, internally or externally, because complaining about physical discomfort was a habit he'd lost so long ago he could barely remember having it. At 7:20, Elara's assistant came to find him with the information that Ms. Wycliffe was ready to leave and that the car was waiting in the structure on level 3. Ronan fell into position. They took the enclosed walkway to the 2nd floor of the structure, then the elevator to level 3. And there was the armored SUV, big and dark, and sitting in its reserved space with the engine already running, the company driver visible behind the wheel. Everything looked right. It did not feel right. He stood at the elevator threshold and felt the thing he had no better word for than wrongness. An accumulation of small observations his conscious mind hadn't fully processed yet. The driver's left side mirror was angled slightly down, not the driving position. The subtle haze of exhaust was heavier than it should be for an engine that had been running 3 minutes. And the SUV, which had assigned parking on the driver's side wall, had several feet more clearance on its left than usual, which meant it was parked fractionally further from the wall than yesterday. He took all of this in during approximately 2 seconds. He said, "Wait here." I'm sorry? Elara's assistant started to say something, but he was already moving, not running, because running would tell anyone watching that he'd seen something, and he didn't know yet where they were watching from. He moved purposefully. He walked to the driver's window and tapped it. The driver, Marcus, 50s, 22 years with the company, lowered it and looked at him with the expression of a man who found being checked on faintly insulting. "You good?" Ronan asked. "Fine. Ready when she is." "How long has the engine been running?" "Pulled up about 3-4 minutes ago. Why?" "Anything feel off during the approach? Any sound from the undercarriage?" Marcus frowned. "There was something. Coming up the ramp from level 2, I thought it was road noise. It stopped." Ronan crouched and looked under the front end of the vehicle. The light was bad and he needed his phone's flashlight, which he had on in under 4 seconds. He scanned from front axle back toward the firewall. The hydraulic brake line ran where it should, except at the coupling near the front driver's wheel, the fitting was loose, not broken, not severed, sitting just offset enough that pressure buildup from repeated braking on the descent ramp would eventually push fluid past the seal. Once that happened, the vehicle would have diminishing braking response. On a flat surface, manageable. On a descending parking ramp with a right-angle turn at the bottom, potentially unsurvivable. He came back up. He was already moving toward Elara. "We're not taking this vehicle," he said. She had seen his face during the approach, and her expression had shifted from impatience to something more guarded. "What's wrong with it?" "The brake line is compromised. Someone partially disconnected the hydraulic fitting." He kept his voice even, because her remaining calm depended partly on his. If Marcus had taken this down the exit ramp, steering control would have failed before the bottom turn. The assistant made a small, involuntary sound. Marcus got out of the vehicle very quickly and stepped away from it as if it had become something other than what he'd thought it was. Elara didn't move. She looked at Ronan for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, not yet. More like the particular stillness of someone absorbing information that has just fundamentally changed their understanding of something. "You checked under the car," she said. "Yes." "Why? What made you—" "The parking position was wrong, a few feet off from yesterday." He held her gaze. "When a familiar object is in a slightly wrong position, someone moved it. And if someone moved the car before Marcus got in it, I needed to know why." She absorbed this. "Call it in," she said quietly. "All of it." "Already texted Dale. I need you to come with me, away from this vehicle, back through the walkway. We're taking the stairs, not the elevator." "Why the stairs?" "Because whoever did this expected you to exit this structure in that vehicle. If they're watching the exits, they're watching the elevator feeds too. The stairs aren't on the same camera loop." She looked at him for one beat. Just one. The length of time it took to decide whether to trust a man she'd known for 11 days. And then she said, "Lead." He led. They went through the walkway fast, Elara matching his pace without complaint. Her assistant was on the phone behind them, voice low and tight. The stairwell smelled of concrete and old fluorescent light, and the kind of industrial quiet that made every footstep louder than it should be. On the ground floor, he pushed the exit door open 3 inches first, scanned the visible portion of the lobby, then opened it fully. "We're clear," he said. "That's a relative term right now," Elara said, but she walked through. The investigation took the rest of the evening and most of the night. Dale was there. Building security was there. And eventually, faster than Ronan had expected, which suggested the call to Elara's vehicle constituted some kind of escalation threshold. 2 federal agents from a department that went by initials he recognized appeared and began asking questions with the particular thoroughness of people who had been waiting for a reason to be in this building. He answered what they asked and didn't offer more than they asked for, because that was always the right approach with federal investigators, regardless of which side of the relationship you were on. Marcus was cleared within an hour. The brake line had been accessed between 5:40 and 6:15 p.m. In the gap between Marcus's last vehicle check and the moment he'd driven up to the executive level, 22 minutes when Level 3's looping camera system had given whoever did this exactly the window they needed. The access log for Level 3 showed 2 entries during that window. One was Marcus's. The other was a badge registered to a maintenance contractor whose company had been providing HVAC services to Asterion for the past 18 months. The HVAC contractor had no record of sending anyone to level 3 that afternoon. The investigation was still running at midnight when Ronan finally drove home, and by that point Tessa had been at Mrs. Paulson's for 4 hours longer than he'd promised, and Mrs. Paulson's texts had moved from understanding to pointed. He apologized on the phone while driving and heard the quality of Mrs. Paulson's acceptance and understood that he had one, maybe two more of these situations before it stopped being something she could accommodate. I was aware, without fully allowing himself to sit with it, that this was the fundamental problem. He couldn't do this job and be the father he needed to be with any degree of reliability. The two things were pulling in opposite directions in a way that was going to require a decision at some point. He pushed that thought aside. He was good at pushing that thought aside. He'd had practice. Tessa was asleep on Mrs. Paulson's couch with a blanket that smelled like someone else's home. He carried her to the truck, settled her in the passenger seat, and drove through empty streets. "Dad," she said, not awake exactly, somewhere between. "Yeah." "Did everything go okay?" He thought about the SUV, about the loose fitting on the brake line, about Elara Wycliffe standing in a parking structure absorbing the reality that someone had tried to kill her and managing to ask precise, intelligent questions about it instead of falling apart. "It went okay," he said. She made a sound that meant she'd accepted that answer and was going back to sleep, and he drove the rest of the way in the dark. I was back at 7 the next morning. He spent 2 days after the parking structure incident doing something that Dale's protocol didn't technically sanction and that Dale didn't technically inquire about. He began reconstructing the full pattern of what had been done to Asterian's internal security over the preceding months. Not just the recent incidents. He went back. He pulled camera calibration records, access badge logs, maintenance contractor sign-ins, emergency procedure drill reports, schedule modifications. He laid them out in a sequence and looked at the shape. The shape was patient. That was the word he kept coming back to. Patient and layered, like something built by someone who understood that the most reliable plan was the one that prepared for failure at every step. The fire door probe had happened 6 weeks ago. The camera repositioning, 4 weeks. The looping footage installed on the parking structure cameras, 2 weeks. The brake line, last night. These weren't the acts of someone improvising. They were phases. And the attacks weren't designed primarily to hurt Elara, at least not yet. They were designed to frighten her, isolate her, make her feel that nowhere inside her own company was safe. There was a purpose to the fear. Frightened people made decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. Frightened executives signed paperwork they'd otherwise refuse. He found the paperwork when he asked Elara's assistant, carefully, as a routine security question, whether there had been any unusual board-level pressure on Ms. Wycliffe in recent months. The assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had been doing this job for 11 months and had the look of someone who trusted very few people but had been deciding which category to put Ronan in, said, "There's been a motion to divest the Defense Systems Division. It comes up in board meetings and it keeps coming back even after she tables it. 3 board members keep pushing it. Who benefits from the divestiture?" Priya looked at him. "I don't know who buys it, but Victor Sloan has been the loudest voice for it." Victor Sloan, the chief operating officer, who had been with Asterion for 11 years and was, by most accounts, the second most powerful person in the company. Ronan had seen him twice in the corridors. A tall man in his mid-50s with the particular authority of someone who had spent decades being deferred to, who carried his influence like something he barely had to think about anymore. He noted the name. He didn't do anything with it yet. He didn't have enough. What he had was the feeling, confirmed by everything the pattern told him, that this was moving toward something. The phases were accelerating. 6 weeks, then 4, then 2, then 1 night. The gaps were shrinking. Whoever was doing this was approaching a decision point, the moment when the accumulated pressure would be enough to demand an answer. He was thinking about all of this on a Tuesday afternoon when he found the envelope. It was on his desk in the security office, not slipped under the door, not left in his inbox, placed directly in the center of his desk surface with the kind of deliberateness that said, "We were here, in this room, and we want you to know it." A standard white envelope, his name handwritten on the front. No return, no postmark. Inside was a single photograph. He recognized the street. He recognized the angle, taken from across the road, maybe from a vehicle, with a long lens. He recognized the worn sole of his own boot. He recognized Tessa, walking beside him in her yellow jacket, her backpack too large for her frame. Her head turned slightly as she talked about something. This was 3 days ago. He remembered the morning because she'd been upset about a girl in her class, and he'd been trying to listen while also being mostly awake. On the back of the photograph, 4 words in the same handwriting as his name on the envelope. Walk away. Keep her safe. He sat with that for a moment. The photograph on the desk, the 4 words facing up, the absolute quiet of the security office. And he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He let the fear in. Not the controlled, functional fear he'd worked with his whole career. The sharpened alertness that made you faster and more careful. This was something different. The fear that came from knowing that the line between his life at work and his daughter's life at home, a line he'd spent 2 years trying to draw and maintain and guard with everything he had just been crossed. They knew about Tessa. They'd been watching him long enough to follow him home, learn his routines, photograph his daughter on the street, and they'd left this on his desk to tell him so. He sat with that for exactly as long as he allowed himself to sit with it. Then he put the photograph back in the envelope and pressed his palms flat against the desk and made the only decision he could actually live with. He walked down the hall and knocked on the frame of Elara's open office door. She was at her desk with 2 monitors open and a pen in her hand that she'd apparently been using to annotate something on paper, which struck him as a detail. That she still worked on paper sometimes, that she annotated. She looked up. He crossed the room and placed the envelope on her desk. Someone left this for me this morning, he said. You need to see it. She took the photograph out. She looked at it for long enough that he could see her registering what it was and what it meant. She turned it over and read the 4 words. She set it down carefully. Your daughter, she said. Yes. She looked up at him. He expected questions. How did they know? How did they get in the building? What was he going to do? Instead, she said something he hadn't expected. Are you going to leave? He held her gaze. I'm here to tell you what's happening. I'm not here to hand in my credentials. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her running through what this meant. The implication that her threat was now his daughter's threat, that someone was willing to use a 7-year-old girl as leverage in a corporate conspiracy that had already attempted vehicular homicide. They're escalating, she said. Yes. Because they think the pressure is working. Because someone on the board is watching the outcome of each incident and calculating whether I'm close to the threshold. She pressed her pen against the desk. Not hard. A controlled gesture. Victor has been on the phone twice today with board members I don't recognize from his personal contact list. Ronan looked at her. You monitor his communications? I monitor what my IT security team flags as anomalous. She met his eyes evenly. Victor has been using a personal phone for certain calls. That's what's anomalous. That's significant. I know what it's significant of, she said quietly. I'm not ready to say it out loud yet. Because once I say it, I have to act on it. And acting on it wrong could destroy everything I've built here. She paused. So right now I'm telling you so that you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. He noted. He picked up the envelope. He needed to log it with Dale, get it into the federal investigation that was still running. He needed to make calls tonight, one in particular, to a man he hadn't spoken to in over a year, a former teammate whose number was still in his phone under a name that wasn't his real name. He needed to think about Tessa. I'll handle the filing on this end, he said, but you should know, whoever put this on my desk came through at least 2 access-controlled areas to do it. Your security perimeter is not as sealed as your team believes. Elara's jaw tightened slightly. I know. Dale needs to know how serious this is. Dale knows what I've told him. There are things I haven't told him yet. She held his gaze. I trust you to understand why that is. He understood. Information in a compromised organization was a weapon, and you didn't hand it to people until you were certain of which side of the line they stood on. He had a list of people in Asterion he was reasonably certain about. He had a shorter list of people he was fully certain about. Elara Wycliffe was on the shorter list. Be careful with your schedule tonight, he said. Don't use the parking structure. I wasn't planning to. I'll have a route for you. Different car. I'll drive. She looked at him for a moment. You know this goes well beyond your job description. I've been aware of that since day one, he said. I'm still here. He walked out of her office, through the corridor and out to the parking lot, where he sat in his truck and called the man whose number was saved under the wrong name and who answered on the second ring the way he always had, as if no time had passed at all. "I need a favor," Ronan said. There was a brief pause on the other end. "How big?" Ronan looked at the photograph still in the envelope on the passenger seat beside him, his daughter's yellow jacket, the too large backpack. "Big enough that I'm asking," he said. The man on the other end exhaled slowly. "Tell me what you need." Outside the truck, the parking lot was quiet and ordinary, and entirely indifferent to what was happening inside it. The way places always were when the people inside them were carrying something too heavy to put down and too dangerous to set aside. The man on the other end of the phone was named Garrett Cole, and he was not a man who asked unnecessary questions. Ronan had served with Garrett for 6 years, in places that didn't appear on deployment records and during operations that had no official names. Garrett was now living in a town 3 hours north, running a security consulting firm that actually did consulting work, which was something Ronan had always appreciated about him. That when Garrett said he was done with the other kind of work, he meant it. He had a wife, 2 kids in middle school, and a reputation for being unreachable after 6 in the evening unless the situation qualified as genuine emergency. Ronan calling from a parking lot at 8:15 with a photograph of his daughter on the seat beside him apparently qualified. The arrangement they agreed to was simple and required no elaboration. Garrett would come down Friday morning, take Tessa to stay with his family for what Ronan would tell her was a long overdue visit, and she would remain there until Ronan said otherwise. Garrett's wife, Dana, had met Tessa twice and liked her, and Tessa liked Dana's dog, which was a large, good-natured animal named Brick, who allowed himself to be dressed in doll clothes without apparent complaint. "She'll want to know why," Ronan said. "Kids always do. Tell her you've got a work situation. She's 7. She'll ask follow-up questions. Then tell her Brick needs company." A brief pause. "It's actually true. He ate one of the kids' shoes last week. We're worried about him." Ronan sat with that for a moment, the absurdity of it alongside the reality of it, and felt something loosen fractionally in his chest. Not much. Enough. "Friday," he said. Garrett confirmed. "And Ronan, whatever this is, don't sit on it trying to manage it alone. I'm calling you. You're asking me to watch your kid. That's not the same thing." He didn't have an answer for that, and Garrett didn't push it, which was one of the things about Garrett that had always made him trustworthy in ways that mattered. He knew the difference between what needed to be said and what just needed to be heard. Ronan drove home and made Tessa dinner, scrambled eggs because it was late and she'd already eaten at Mrs. Paulson's but wanted something. And while she sat at the kitchen table eating and telling him about the girl in her class with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had been waiting all day to have this particular conversation, he listened and responded and noted, somewhere in the part of his mind that never fully shut off, that she seemed fine. She seemed entirely ordinary. She didn't know about the photograph. She didn't know that someone had followed them 2 mornings ago and taken pictures from across the street. She didn't know, and he was going to keep it that way. "Her name is Sophie," Tessa said, "and she said my drawing didn't look like a horse." What did it look like? She considered this very seriously. "She said a potato." "Did it look like a potato?" "It looked like a horse that was having a hard day," Tessa said, with complete conviction. He washed the dishes after she went to bed and stood at the kitchen sink for a long time looking at the window above it, which reflected the kitchen back at him in the dark. Himself, the counter, the refrigerator with its collection of Tessa's drawings held on by magnets from places they'd been, or places he'd been before she was born, that he'd accumulated and kept because he liked the idea of carrying something from each of them. He thought about the 4 words on the back of the photograph. He thought about what the right response was. He was still thinking about it when he went to bed, and he woke up at 5:15 with the thinking already resolved in the way that sometimes happened. Not through any process he could track, just that his brain had continued working after he stopped directing it and had arrived somewhere. The right response was not to leave. The right response was to look like he was leaving. He spent the next 48 hours being very careful about what he allowed people to see. He was quieter than usual in the security office. He filed his reports without his normal addenda. He answered Dale's questions in shorter sentences and without the follow-up observations that Dale had begun to rely on more than he'd admitted. When Elara passed him in the corridor on Wednesday morning, he didn't match her gaze with the usual brief acknowledgement. He looked slightly past her, the body language of someone beginning to disengage. He did all of this deliberately, and with the discomfort of knowing that Elara was sharp enough to notice a change in his behavior and would likely read it incorrectly, and that he couldn't explain it to her yet without risking the very thing he was trying to construct. Wednesday afternoon, he asked Dale for a private word and told him, with the expression of a man who had made a difficult decision, that the photograph of his daughter had made him reconsider his position, that he had a child to think about, that he wasn't sure this kind of work, at this level of risk, was something he could do without knowing she was exposed. Dale listened without interrupting. When Ronan finished, Dale said, "You sure about this?" "No," Ronan said honestly, "but I can't wait until I'm sure." Dale nodded slowly. He had the look of a man absorbing a loss he'd half expected and hadn't found a way to prevent. "I'll start the paperwork for a separation of contract. You want to finish out the week?" "2 more days, then I'll be gone." He submitted his written resignation Thursday morning. By afternoon, it had apparently moved through the administrative channels in a way that suggested at least 2 people in the building, people who had access to HR communications and who shouldn't have had that access, had seen it within hours of its filing. He knew this because on Thursday, at 3 in the afternoon, Victor Sloan walked past the security office, and through the window Ronan saw him pause in the corridor and take out his personal phone and make a call. Ronan couldn't hear the conversation. He could read the body language of a man who had just received news he'd been waiting for and was confirming it to someone who'd been waiting to hear it. Good. The bait had been taken. What neither Victor nor whoever was on the other end of that call knew was that Ronan had spent the previous night inside the Asterion facility. He'd returned at 2 in the morning through the drainage access route he'd noted 3 weeks earlier when he'd been studying the facility's infrastructure plans. A maintenance channel running beneath the western perimeter that had been flagged in the engineering documents as decommissioned but had never actually been sealed. It was cramped and wet and smelled like old concrete and metal, and navigating it in the dark without a light source, because a light source would show on any thermal system that happened to be functioning, had taken longer than he'd wanted and had cost him both kneecaps worth of skin that he had discovered painfully upon reaching the other end. But he'd mapped the inside of that hangar. Because there was a hangar. The Asterion flight testing facility sat 2 miles from the main campus, connected to the main complex by a private road that appeared on internal maps, but not on public satellite imagery, because the facility handled government contract work, and the government had requested its omission from publicly accessible mapping data. Ronan had seen the facility listed in the infrastructure documents during his first week. He'd visited it officially once, during a security assessment sweep that Dale had assigned him. He'd noted then that it had a layout that could be very difficult to exit from if someone controlled the exterior access points. On Wednesday evening, he'd told Elara, in a brief and careful conversation conducted in the building's least monitored stairwell, what he was planning. He kept it short because short was all the situation allowed. "They're going to move on you soon," he said. "My leaving is going to look like your protection gap. They've been waiting for that." She was very still. "You're staging your resignation." "Yes." "To let them think they can get to me. To let them commit to a plan they've already half built, because a plan in motion leaves evidence, and evidence is what the federal investigation needs to move on, Victor." He held her gaze. "But you're going to have to actually be in the trap for this to work." "I see that," she said. Her voice was level. He noted that. "What's the trap?" "I don't know the exact mechanism yet. They'll manufacture a reason to get you alone in a controlled space. The hangar is my best read. It's isolated. It has communication blackout zones, and they've had contractor access to it for the past 6 weeks. He paused. "When the summons comes, I need you to go. And if it goes wrong, I'll be there before it goes wrong." She considered him for a moment. "You're certain about this?" "I'm certain about the plan. I'm not certain about every variable." He made himself hold the eye contact. "If you're asking whether I can guarantee you walk out of there safely, I can't guarantee that. This is an honest answer." She looked at him for long enough that he had time to think about what he'd just said, and whether it had been the right thing to say, and whether there was a version of this that didn't require putting her in a room with people who had already tried to kill her. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll go?" All right, I understand what you're telling me, and yes, I'll go. She glanced toward the stairwell door, then back. What about Tessa? He told her briefly that Tessa was being moved somewhere safe. She hadn't pressed for details, and he'd appreciated that. She's with people I trust, he said. She thinks she's on a spontaneous vacation. Is she okay with that? She was very excited about the dog, he said. I explained that Brick needed company, and she accepted it completely. Something moved across Elara's expression. Not quite a smile, a smaller thing than that, but something. I don't know many 7-year-olds who'd rather focus on a dog than on the disruption to their routine. She has her priorities, he said. He'd driven Tessa to Garrett's on Friday morning before the sun was fully up. She'd been half asleep in the passenger seat and had asked, with the drowsy but persistent logic of a child who noticed inconsistencies, why they were going so early. Brick's a morning animal, Ronan had said. He gets lonely. Dogs sleep half the day. Brick's different. She'd thought about this. Is something happening at work? He'd kept his hands on the wheel. There's some stuff I need to handle. Is it dangerous stuff? He had held that question for several seconds, weighing the competing obligations of a parent who wanted to protect his child, and a person who had always believed that children deserved honest answers more than comfortable ones. It's complicated stuff, he said, but I'm being careful. Tessa had looked at him in the particular way she had, the cataloging look, the one that was entirely too perceptive for 7 years old. And then she'd turned and looked at the road ahead and said, okay, with the tone of someone who had filed this information under things to worry about later and was choosing to trust him for now. He had dropped her at Garrett's, and she'd run toward the door before he'd fully stopped the truck because she'd seen Brick in the front window, and that was the last image he'd carried with him into the rest of this. His daughter running toward a dog, the sky going from dark to gray behind her, her sneakers hitting the wet driveway. He had carried that image through the drainage channel in the dark, and through the hangar and back, and he was still carrying it now. Boltonk. The summons came Saturday evening. It came to Elara's phone as a message from a number she recognized. A board member named Patricia Gorham, 62, legacy board appointment, someone Elara had described to Ronan as reliable and non-aligned with Victor's faction. The message said there was an emergency board situation requiring her immediate confidential presence. A location? The flight testing hangar. A reason? An undisclosed federal audit concern that required physical access to facility records stored on site. Elara forwarded the message to Ronan with 3 words of her own. Is this it? He was already at the hangar, had been for 3 hours. He'd entered through the drainage channel again at 4 in the afternoon and worked his way into the building while it was still quiet. And he'd spent those 3 hours in the dark interior of a facility that smelled of aviation fuel and metal and the particular cold that comes from concrete floors absorbing winter. He'd mapped the interior space against the plan he'd memorized. He'd identified the positions where a team of men could stage without being visible from the entrance. He'd found the communications equipment that had been installed along the north wall, portable signal blockers, the kind used by private military contractors, which told him everything he needed to know about the level of preparation this operation represented. He'd also found the fuel system manifold on the east wall near the secondary maintenance bay, which had been accessed recently and incompletely reassembled in a way that would allow pressure to build in the primary fuel lines without triggering the automatic shutoff. Someone had essentially built a slow-motion emergency into the building's infrastructure and left it armed. He noted that and worked around it and chose his position in the rafters above the main floor, a steel catwalk that ran the length of the hangar and that had the advantage of darkness and the disadvantage of being above the only thing he genuinely feared in enclosed spaces, fire. To Elara's message, he sent back 1 word, yes. Then, confirm location to your federal contact and go. Do not deviate from the route Marcus drives. Do not stop for anything. Her response took 4 minutes. He counted them. Then, already called. In the car. He settled into his position. He checked his phone to no further messages, and then silenced it and put it in his left jacket pocket and let the silence of the hangar settle around him. He had been in positions like this one before. Different spaces, different stakes. The waiting was always the same, not peaceful, not tense, but something between the two that had no good name, where your body was ready and your mind was working, but there was nothing yet to direct it toward. and you existed in the gap between preparation and action. He thought about Tessa, and then he put it away. He thought about the fuel manifold and what it meant if they planned to use it, and he put that calculation in a place he could access quickly when he needed it. He breathed. He waited. At 8:14, he heard the exterior gates engage. The sound was mechanical and definitive, the kind of sound a gate makes when it locks rather than opens, which was the wrong sound for a facility receiving a visitor. He registered that and adjusted his understanding of the timeline. They'd locked the gate when her vehicle was inside the perimeter, which meant she was already committed to the space. He heard the SUV's engine die, heard a car door, then voices, Elara's and others. Male voices. More than 2. He counted from the acoustic signature, 4, possibly 5. Positioned around the hangar floor, having entered through the side access doors that were not visible from the main entrance. They'd been here before her. They'd been waiting. He shifted his weight on the catwalk and moved toward the east end, where the angle gave him the best line of sight to the hangar floor below. In the dim emergency lighting, the overhead systems were off. Someone had cut the main power to the overhead panels. He could make out figures, security uniforms, the Asterion insignia on the shoulders, men standing in the spread formation of people who had been told where to stand by someone who knew what they were doing. And Victor Sloan. He was standing 15 feet from Elara with his jacket on and his hands at his sides, and the air of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment and was now inhabiting it with more relief than satisfaction. He was not a physical threat in the direct sense, mid-50s, desk-built, soft at the edges in ways that fieldwork eliminated, but he was standing like a man who knew he had the room and what was in it. "Elara," Victor said, his voice carried in the empty space, "I appreciate you being reasonable about this." "I don't know what I'm being yet," Elara said. Her voice was steady. He told her, "Stay composed, stay verbal, buy time." She was doing it. "You want to tell me why there's no board meeting and why the gate just locked behind me?" "Because we're past the point of board meetings," Victor said. "We've been past it for 6 weeks. You've had every opportunity to make the reasonable choice, and you've declined to make it. The reasonable choice being to sign over the defense division to a buyer who will pay a fair price and who has the infrastructure to develop it appropriately." Victor moved slightly, not toward her but shifting his weight, the body language of someone who was used to controlling spaces. "The problem, Elara, is that you've consistently prioritized your personal stake over the company's best interest. The board agrees." 3 members of the board agree. Under circumstances I'm beginning to understand a lot better than I did 2 weeks ago. Victor was quiet for a moment. "Your security situation has been deteriorating significantly. That's unfortunate. Threatening, even. I can understand why a CEO in that position might feel she needed to make decisions quickly." "You mean the brake line," Elara said, "or the camera system, or the fire door? Which part of my deteriorating security situation are you particularly referring to?" "I'm referring to whatever you feel is most compelling." Victor's voice hadn't changed. "The point is that you're going to sign the authorization tonight, and then you're going to have some time, a few days, in a secure location, to allow the transaction to process without interference." "And if I don't sign?" Victor didn't answer immediately. One of the uniformed men shifted position. Ronan moved. He went east along the catwalk to the secondary ladder, a fixed metal ladder bolted to the wall that led down to the maintenance bay on the hangar floor's east end, behind the positioning of Victor's men. He'd measured the angle of this approach during his nighttime reconnaissance, and he knew that from Victor's position at the center of the floor, the maintenance bay entrance was in shadow and partially blocked by a parked equipment cart. He went down the ladder quickly and quietly. The rungs were cold and slightly oiled, and the last 4 feet he dropped rather than climbed because the sound of boots on metal in a quiet space carried. He landed, absorbed the impact, stayed still. Nobody had heard. He let his eyes adjust. The maintenance bay was machinery and shadow and the fuel manifold on the east wall. He checked the manifold. The pressure indicator he could read from this angle was reading higher than it had 3 hours ago. They'd remotely engaged something since then. The system was building. He was calculating time when he heard Elara's voice again, sharper now. "I'm not signing anything, Victor. I think you'll find that position difficult to maintain. Call it a character flaw." There was a pause, and then the sound of movement. not one of the guards, Victor himself, taking several steps. Ronan moved to the bay entrance and looked through the gap between the equipment cart and the wall. Victor had a phone in his hand. He was showing Elara something on the screen. From where Ronan stood, he couldn't see what it was, but he saw Elara's face. She kept it composed, but something crossed her eyes, a quick crack in the surface. The specific look of someone who has just seen something that landed. "Your security consultant filed his resignation 4 days ago," Victor said. "He's gone, which means you've been coming here tonight with the impression that you had some kind of contingency. You don't. Whatever Ronan Hale told you he was going to do, he's not here." Ronan stepped out from behind the equipment cart. "He's been here since 4 this afternoon," he said. The sound that moved through the hangar in the 2 seconds following that sentence was not silence. It was the sound of multiple people processing a fact that had destroyed their operating premise simultaneously. Victor turned. The 2 nearest guards turned. The other 2, positioned near the main doors, shifted toward the sound of his voice. He moved while they were still deciding. The first guard covered 12 feet before Ronan covered 8, which meant Ronan arrived where the guard was going before the guard completed the decision to be there. It was a technique that had less to do with speed than with reading the body before it moved. The weight shift, the direction the head committed to half a second before the feet. He redirected the guard's forward momentum into the equipment cart beside them, and the man went down loud and stayed down. The second guard was smarter. He stopped advancing and changed to containment, moving to cut off the angle between Ronan and Elara. Ronan let him. He wasn't going toward Elara yet. He needed the room's spatial geometry to shift before that approach was viable. He moved lateral, pulling the guard's attention right, and in that pull the guard's positioning opened a corridor between his left and the maintenance bay entrance. The third and fourth guards, from the main door, were covering distance but hadn't reached him yet. He had a window of approximately 4 seconds. He moved through it. He reached Elara, got a hand at her arm. Not a grip, a direction, a body saying this way, and pulled her movement into the maintenance bay before the third guard closed the angle. "Move," he said, which was unnecessary because she was already moving. Behind them he heard the sounds of the 2 near-door guards changing direction. Victor's voice. Something sharp and controlled that Ronan didn't fully parse because he was counting steps to the manifold and calculating what he was going to do about it. He stopped at the manifold. The pressure indicator confirmed what he'd feared. The system was now at a level that, combined with whatever remote command they'd used to engage it, would reach critical threshold in somewhere between 8 and 14 minutes. After that, the fuel line would fail. What that failure produced in a closed hangar would depend on ignition sources, of which there were several. He looked at the manifold. He knew what needed to happen, but it required both hands and approximately 90 seconds, and he did not have 90 seconds. "How do I help?" Elara said. He looked at her. She was watching him with the specific focus of someone who had assessed the situation and determined that the correct response was to be useful rather than frightened, and he was briefly and completely grateful for that. "Here," he said. He guided her hands to the primary shutoff valve, a large manual wheel that required significant torque. "Turn this counterclockwise. Don't stop. Don't worry about the sound it makes. Just keep turning until it won't go anymore." He left her at the valve and turned back to the maintenance bay entrance. 2 guards came through it within 4 seconds of each other. He worked with their timing rather than against it. The first one through gave him an angle that blocked the second, and he used that sequence, that brief window when the first guard's body was between him and the second. It was not elegant. He took a hit to the left side that he registered and filed and dealt with later. What mattered was that both men were on the floor. From behind him, the metallic resistance of the shutoff valve reaching its limit, then Elara's voice. It stopped. He turned. The pressure indicator was dropping, slowly, but dropping. "Good," he said. "That buys time." He looked at her. The question in his face was whether she was hurt. "I'm fine," she said. "Victor has a remote lock on all exterior doors. I heard him tell one of the guards." "I know." "The main entrance, the side access doors, the emergency panels. I know." He moved toward the wall. "There's another way out." She looked at where he was heading, the floor-level grating on the maintenance bay's east wall, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, a drainage access cover with a recessed handle. "You're not serious," she said. "I came in through it 4 hours ago." He crouched and got the handle. The cover was heavy, and it did not want to move, and it made a sound when it did move that he hadn't fully accounted for. A grinding scrape of metal that went through the quiet space like an announcement. "That's going to tell them where we are," Elara said. Yes. He got the cover fully open. The channel below was dark. Ladies first felt inappropriate, so he didn't say it. Instead, he said, "It's about 40 feet to the exterior. There's a turn about halfway. Go on your elbows if the ceiling is too low. It levels out before the end." She looked at the opening. He could see her cataloging her options and coming up with the same answer he had. Then she got down and went in, and he followed, and he pulled the grating back into position behind him as best he could from inside, which was imperfectly, but well enough. The channel was cold and dark, and smelled exactly as it had at 2 in the morning when he'd navigated it going the other direction. Ahead of him he could hear Elara moving, steadily, without hesitation, no commentary. He focused on the sound of her movement and matched it. The turn came at 30 feet. The channel jogged left and the ceiling dropped another 4 inches for approximately 8 feet and then came back up. He heard Elara adjust, a brief pause, then the scrape of movement resuming at the lower clearance. He was thinking about the fuel manifold and whether the pressure drop would hold long enough. He was thinking about the guards in the maintenance bay and whether any of them were conscious and whether any of them had communicated their position to Victor. He was thinking about the federal agents Elara had called before leaving and how long response time would be at this hour on a Saturday to a location 2 miles from the main campus on a road that didn't appear on public maps. He was also thinking about the cold coming through the knees of his pants, where he'd already lost skin the previous night and was losing more now, and he was making a private note that this was something he was going to be aware of for the next several days, and that Tessa was going to notice immediately and ask questions that he would answer with the word work. The end of the channel was a barred exterior grate set into the concrete base of the hangar's outer wall. He'd examined it on his reconnaissance and confirmed it could be pushed from the inside. He reached past Elara in the narrow space, close enough that he was aware of her breath and the cold of the air between them, and got both hands on the bar and pushed. It opened. Cold night air. The sound of wind. Elara pulled herself out first and he followed, and they were on the exterior perimeter, the hangar wall at their backs, the fence line 40 feet ahead. The exterior gate, the one that had locked when her SUV entered, was to their left, approximately 60 feet. He heard sirens, distant but approaching. "Federal response," she said, slightly breathless. "Yes." "How did they know where—" "I transmitted the facility location to your contact before I went into the channel." He looked at her. Her jacket was dirty from the crawl. Her hair was not where it had been. There was a scrape on her left palm from the grating. She was otherwise intact. "Are you hurt?" She looked down at her palm. "No." She looked back up. "You transmitted from inside the channel?" "From the turn. There's a signal window at the turn. The angle of the junction lines up with a gap in the external signal blockers." He'd found this on his nighttime reconnaissance and had spent 20 minutes confirming it. 4-second window. It's enough." She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is reassessing the scope of their understanding of a situation. "You planned all of this," she said. "I planned as much of it as I could anticipate." He held her gaze. "The rest was managed as it came up." The rest being approximately half of what just happened. "At least half," he agreed honestly. The sirens were louder. He could see light movement on the private road, vehicle headlights coming fast. Victor, inside the hangar, had apparently reached the same calculation because they heard, faintly, through the hangar wall, the sound of something moving toward the far exterior. Running. The sound of a man who had concluded that controlled exit was no longer an option. Ronan looked at the perimeter fence and then at the external gate and made the call. "The gate's locked from inside, but the control panel is exterior mounted." He moved toward it. The federal vehicles were visible now, 2 of them, coming up the private road without hesitation, which meant they had the facility coordinates exactly. The gate control panel was a standard keypad with an emergency mechanical override, a physical key slot beneath the panel housing that building codes required for emergency responder access. He'd noted it on his first official visit to the facility 6 weeks ago, when he'd been making the mental inventory of access and egress points that he'd been building ever since he'd first seen the scratches around a fire door lock and understood what they meant. He got the panel open. The override required a specific fire department key that he did not have, but the wiring behind the panel, once exposed, was straightforward enough. It took him approximately 40 seconds. The gate swung open. The first federal vehicle came through it before it had fully opened, which suggested a level of urgency on the federal side that he found professionally reassuring. He stepped back. Elara stepped beside him. The agents who came out of the vehicles moved with the focused efficiency of people who had been briefed and were acting on that briefing, past Ronan and Elara, without stopping, into the facility through the gate, communicating in the clipped shorthand of coordinated response. One agent, a woman who moved with the authority of the person in charge of this operation, peeled off from the rest and came to them. "Ms. Wycliffe," she said. "Here," Elara said. The agent looked at Ronan. Something moved in her expression. He'd seen that look before. The specific look of someone who had read a file and was now comparing it to what was standing in front of them. "Mr. Hale." "Agent," he said. "You want to tell me how you got into a sealed facility?" "There's a drainage channel under the west perimeter wall. It's listed as decommissioned in the engineering records." "Listed, but not sealed." "No." She looked at him for another beat. "We'll need a full debrief." "I know." He glanced toward the hangar. "Victor Sloan was moving toward the north end of the facility when we exited. He may try the perimeter fence near the secondary maintenance access." The agent was already communicating this through her radio before he'd finished the sentence, which told him the federal operation around this situation was more developed than he'd fully appreciated. They'd been building toward this longer than he'd known, and what Elara had triggered by calling them tonight had accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. He filed that and let it go. Elara was standing beside him, watching the federal agents move through the compound with the expression of someone who was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She had her arms crossed, not defensively. She was cold. The night air was significant, and she'd been moving through concrete channels in it. He took off his jacket and put it around her shoulders. She started to object. "Don't," he said. She didn't. She pulled it closed at the front, and they stood there at the open gate watching the operation unfold in the facility she'd built from the ground up, and that had been quietly, systematically turned against her by people she had trusted and promoted and paid well. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say yet that the night hadn't already said more clearly. From somewhere on the north perimeter, they heard a shout. Federal agents, the sound of a situation being contained. Victor Sloan was not getting through the fence. Elara let out a breath. It was not a sound of relief exactly. It was something older than relief, the sound of a sustained tension finally allowed to find its endpoint. She stood in his jacket and looked at what remained of a plan that had taken someone months to build and had come apart in a single night, and he stood beside her and thought about a 7-year-old girl sleeping in a house 3 hours north, unaware, safe, and thought, that's what any of this was ever actually for. The agent with the radio came back and said they needed Elara inside a secure vehicle for the debrief, and Elara nodded and took a step and then stopped. She turned back. "Ronan," she said. He looked at her. She had the jacket close around her. Her expression was composed, but there was something underneath it that she was choosing not to say yet, and he recognized that choice because he'd been making it himself for weeks. The things held back not from dishonesty, but from the knowledge that some words needed more than the right moment. They needed the right ground under them, and this was not that ground yet. "Thank you," she said. It was not all she meant. He understood that. "Get warm," he said. She got in the vehicle. The door closed. The lights inside illuminated her briefly. The pale profile, the borrowed jacket, the stillness of someone finally allowed to stop moving. And then the tinted windows took her back. Ronan stood at the gate. Around him, the facility moved with the controlled activity of an operation reaching its conclusion, and somewhere inside the hangar, the fuel pressure continued its slow descent from what it had been, and Victor Sloan was being walked back toward the vehicles in handcuffs that he would not have believed 4 hours ago were part of tonight's plan. Ronan put his hands in his pockets and waited for whoever needed to talk to him next. His left side ached where the guard's elbow had landed, the kind of deep bruise that wouldn't show until tomorrow. He noted it, filed it, dealt with it later. The debrief lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes, which Ronan knew because he checked his watch at the beginning and at the end, and did not check it in between, because checking it in between would have communicated impatience to people he needed to remain cooperative with. The federal agents conducted it in a mobile command unit parked outside the hangar facility. A converted panel van with folding tables and too many people in too little space, and the specific institutional smell of coffee that had been sitting on a burner for too long. The agent in charge was named Samuels, and she had the quality that good investigators always had of appearing to listen casually while actually recording everything with the precision of equipment. Ronan answered her questions in order. He described what he'd observed from his first day at Asterion: the fire door, the camera, the access badge, through the brake line, the looping camera footage, the photograph of Tessa, and the sequence of decisions that had led him into the hangar drainage channel at 4 in the afternoon, carrying a plan that was approximately 60% complete and had required the remaining 40% to be built on the spot. Samuels listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her notes for a moment and then looked back at him. "You transmitted the facility coordinates from inside the drainage channel," she said. "Yes. There's a 4-second signal window at the junction turn. I confirmed it on reconnaissance." "When did you do this reconnaissance?" "Wednesday night, 2 a.m. You broke into a secured federal contractor facility at 2 in the morning to map it." "I entered through an unsealed decommissioned drainage channel to assess the threat environment," Ronan said. "The distinction matters." Samuels considered this. She had the expression of someone who found the distinction less persuasive than he did, but was choosing not to press it at this particular moment. "You should know that we've had an active investigation into Asterion's executive structure for 11 weeks. Your observations from the first day of employment, the fire door, the camera repositioning, the access badge, were independently significant to our case. We'd been building the same picture from the outside." "But you couldn't see inside the camera system," he said. "No. Our access was limited to what we could legally obtain, which wasn't enough to move on." She paused. "What you provided Miss Wycliffe with, the evidence package you transmitted before entering the channel, gave us the interior documentation we needed to act tonight, rather than 3 weeks from now." He absorbed this. 3 weeks from now was a long time. He thought about what 3 more weeks might have looked like, and chose not to complete that thought. "Victor Sloan," he said. "How deep does it go?" Samuel set her pen down. This was a tell. Not a conscious one, he suspected. Just the body making a decision the mind hadn't fully articulated yet about how much to share. "Deep enough that we've been building parallel cases for some time. Sloan isn't the top of this. There's a purchasing entity, a private acquisition firm with connections to foreign defense interests, that has been funding the internal pressure campaign. The 3 board members, the contractor access, the technical personnel who adjusted the camera systems." She paused again. "This wasn't improvised. It was a coordinated acquisition strategy using internal leverage. The goal was to devalue Asterion publicly through security incidents and then force a distressed sale of the defense division at below market value. And Elara wouldn't sign. Elara Wycliffe has been refusing to sign for 4 months. They escalated because they were running out of time. Their acquisition window had a deadline tied to a government contract renewal cycle." Samuels picked her pen back up. "Your appearance complicated their timeline significantly. The resignation was designed to look like their pressure had worked. It did look like that, which is why they moved on tonight's timeline rather than continuing to wait." She looked at him steadily. "You understood that they would." "It was a reasonable calculation," he said. "It was a significant risk to Ms. Wycliffe." "Yes, she understood that." Samuels looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. He recognized the look. It was the one investigators used when they had a secondary question they were deciding whether to ask directly or approach from an angle. She approached it directly. "Your service record, Mr. Hale, most of it is flagged classified." "Yes." "We've seen classified records before. Yours is flagged at a level that required us to make a separate inquiry to access even the unclassified portions." She held his gaze. "I spoke to someone at the DoD this afternoon who asked me, in a tone I found quite serious, to be respectful of your privacy during this debrief." Ronan said nothing. "I'm going to respect that," Samuel said, "but I want you to know that what I've seen, the portions I have access to, is consistent with someone who spent a significant portion of their career doing exactly what you did tonight. Identifying threat patterns before they completed, operating in environments where the plan was never fully complete, managing outcomes under conditions that would, frankly, have been beyond most people. He looked at the table between them. There was a coffee ring on it from a mug that was no longer there. "My daughter needed a father," he said. "That's the whole story." "I understand." Samuel said it without judgment, which he appreciated. "For what it's worth, the DoD contact I spoke to said you were, and I'm quoting here, one of the most capable people they'd ever had to pretend didn't exist." He didn't respond to that. There was no response to that which would have been useful. "We're going to need you available for follow-up interviews as the investigation develops," Samuel said, returning to the practical. "The case against Sloan and the 3 board members is solid. The case against the acquisition firm's principals will take longer. There will be moments over the next several months when your testimony and your observations will be necessary." "I understand. Do you have questions for me?" He thought about it. "The contractor with the HVAC access, the one who entered level 3 on the night of the break line, was he the same person as the maintenance worker with the mismatch badge?" Samuels checked her notes. "Different individuals, connected through the same firm. We have 4 people in total in custody tonight, related to the internal access operations." She looked up. "The man with the mismatch badge. That was the first thing you flagged. Day 1. If you hadn't flagged that, we wouldn't have had a reason to cross-reference the access logs against the contractor firms, and we wouldn't have found the connection to the acquisition group as quickly." He nodded. He didn't find this satisfying in the way he might have once. He mostly found it tiring. "One more question," he said. "Elara, Miss Wycliffe, is she being seen by medical?" "She declined medical assessment. Said she wasn't injured. She has a scrape on her left palm from the drainage channel grating, and she was in a cold environment for an extended period." He paused. "Someone should make sure she's actually warm." Samuels looked at him for just a fraction of a second longer than the observation required. "I'll make sure someone follows up," she said. The debrief ended. He was escorted out of the command van and given a card with a case number and Samuel's direct contact, and he was told he was free to leave but not to travel outside the state without notifying the investigation team, which was a standard instruction that he acknowledged with a nod and filed appropriately. He stood in the night air outside the facility and looked at the sky, which was clear and cold and indifferent, and thought about calling Garrett. He called Garrett. "She's fine," Garrett said before Ronan could say anything. "Sleeping. She and Brick took over the couch, and nobody was willing to disturb the arrangement." He let out a breath. "Okay. You done?" "For tonight." A pause on the other end. Garrett was reading him through the phone the way he always had, from the quality of silences, from what wasn't being said. "You okay?" "I took a hit to the left side. Nothing broken." "That's not what I asked." "I know." He looked at the facility gate, still open from when he'd wired it. Federal vehicles were parked at angles across the private road. There were lights on in the hangar through the high windows. "I'm okay. It went the way it needed to go." "Good enough," Garrett said. "Get some sleep. Don't drive if your left side is making you compensate." "I'm fine." "You always say that, and I'm usually right. And occasionally you're driving on a bruised rib, and don't tell anyone about it for a week." A pause. "Come get her when you're ready. She's fine here. Take a day." He didn't take a day. He drove the 3 hours north the following morning and arrived at Garrett's house at 9:15, and Tessa was in the backyard throwing a tennis ball for Brick, with the total focus of someone who had found her calling. She saw his truck in the driveway and ran toward him and hit him at approximately hip height with the full momentum of a 7-year-old, which contacted exactly the side that had taken the guard's elbow, and he absorbed it and held on and did not make a sound. "You look tired," she said, stepping back and examining him. "I'm fine." "You look like the time you stayed up all night because the pipe under the sink broke." "I didn't stay up all night." "You had the same face." She looked at him with the cataloging eyes. "Did the complicated stuff get less complicated?" "It's getting there," he said. She seemed to accept this. Then, "Can Brick come home with us?" "No." "He's lonely." "He has an entire family." "He likes me specifically." She looked back at the dog, who was sitting at the fence line looking at her with the patient devotion of an animal that had made its preferences clear. "I think I have a gift." "You have a granola bar in your pocket. He can smell it." She checked her pocket. There was, in fact, a granola bar. She seemed to find this less damaging to her theory than he would have expected. "It's still a connection," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder and she leaned into his side, the uninjured side, as though she knew, though she couldn't have. And they stood there in the morning light at the edge of Garrett's yard, and the thing that had been wound tight in his chest since the photograph arrived on his desk, finally, slowly, released its hold. The formal investigation into what federal prosecutors would eventually characterize as a coordinated corporate conspiracy moved quickly by the standards of federal investigations, which meant it moved at a pace that felt glacial to everyone involved, but produced results that were, in Samuel's words, unusually complete. Victor Sloan was charged within 72 hours. The 3 board members followed within a week. The HVAC contractor firm's principals were arrested in 2 separate states on the same morning, which Ronan read about in the news on his phone while eating cereal at the kitchen table, and which Tessa read over his shoulder and asked about. And he said it was a work thing that had wrapped up, and she said, "Oh, good," and went back to her own breakfast. The acquisition firm, the entity behind the entire campaign, had its principals charged federally 2 weeks after that, when the paper trail Ronan had assembled, and the documentary evidence recovered from the hangar and from Victor Sloan's encrypted personal devices combined into something that prosecutors described, in the dry language of legal filings, as comprehensive. What they meant was that there was no gap, no place where the chain of culpability could be credibly interrupted. From the first probe marks on the fire door lock to the remote fuel manifold activation on the night of the hangar, every action connected to every other action connected to the men who had planned and financed it. Ronan gave testimony twice in the weeks following, both times in a federal building downtown, both times in rooms with bad lighting and coffee that was somehow worse than the stuff in the command van. Samuels was present for both sessions, and she had a quality in interview rooms of making the person across from her feel that the most useful thing they could do was simply tell the truth in the most complete terms possible, which Ronan found professionally admirable. During the second session, there was a moment. It came near the end, when the questioning had moved from the events of the night at the hangar to the broader pattern Ronan had documented during his weeks at Asterion. I was describing the timeline, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 night, and the interpretation he'd drawn from it, and he'd said something about the pattern being consistent with military-grade operational planning, and Samuels had looked up from her notes, and the attorney across the table had looked up from his, and the room had a different quality for several seconds. The attorney, 50s, careful, the kind of careful that came from years of working cases where a single imprecise word became a problem, said, "When you say military-grade operational planning, you're speaking from experience with such planning?" "Yes," Ronan said. "Your service record is classified in the portions that would speak to that experience directly, but you're able to characterize it as relevant." "Yes." The attorney made a note. Samuel said nothing, but she held his gaze for a moment, and he understood that she was offering him a choice. He could leave it there, or he could add something, and whichever he chose, she would respect. He left it there. After the session, in the hallway outside the building, concrete walls, the sound of the elevator, the particular institutional echo of government architecture, Samuels fell into step beside him. "She knows," Samuel said, meaning Elara. He hadn't spoken to Elara directly since the night at the hangar. There had been messages, brief, practical, coordinating around the investigation and the company situation. Nothing personal. Both of them, he thought, were doing the same thing, waiting for the ground to stabilize before standing on it. "I figured she'd find out," he said. "The federal agents at the hangar recognized me. One of them served adjacent to your unit about 8 years ago. He said you wouldn't remember him." "I probably don't." "He remembered you very clearly." Samuels paused at the building exit. "For what it's worth, she asked me about your record directly. 2 days after the hangar, she called my office and she asked what I could tell her." He absorbed this. "What did you tell her?" "That your service record was classified, and that the unclassified portions told a story of someone who had chosen, voluntarily and deliberately, to leave an extraordinary career to raise his daughter alone after the loss of her mother. And that the capabilities he'd developed during that career had, in my professional opinion, saved her life and the integrity of her company." Samuels looked at him. She was quiet for a while after that. "What did she say?" She said, "I should have asked him directly." Samuels pulled open the door. "I thought you'd want to know that." He thought about it for the rest of the day, and he was still thinking about it the following morning when his phone rang with Elara's name on the screen. He answered on the third ring. Not the first, because the first ring felt reactive, and he had a constitutionally difficult relationship with reactive responses. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A brief pause, the kind of pause that contained a decision about where to begin. "Are you busy?" "Tessa's at school. I'm doing the dishes." "I called to apologize," she said. He turned off the water. "For what?" "For not asking you directly, about your background, about your record." Another pause. "I asked around you instead of asking you. That wasn't fair." "You had valid reasons." "I had convenient reasons." "That's different." He could hear the quality in her voice, not quite discomfort, something more controlled than that, the sound of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say, and was now discovering that careful preparation didn't make the saying of it easier. "You worked in my building for weeks carrying a history that I was building a file on from the outside instead of just asking the person who had it. If you'd asked me in the first week, I wouldn't have told you much. And now?" He looked out the kitchen window. The yard was ordinary. The neighbor's fence, a bird that had decided the fence post was an acceptable perch. The unremarkable gray of a morning that wasn't doing anything particular. "Now I think you've earned the right to ask whatever you want to ask." The quality of the silence changed. "You were a Navy SEAL," she said. It wasn't really a question. It was the thing being said out loud for the first time between them. "Yes." "Specialized unit, protection and extraction operations, among other things." "Among other things." "And you left voluntarily?" "Yes." "Because of Tessa." "Because Tessa's mother died and Tessa was 4 years old and she needed someone who came home," he said. He said it the way he'd learned to say it, not as something that required managing, but as a fact, the same way you stated that a door was in a wall or a road ran in a particular direction. It had taken him a long time to get to that. "The work I was doing didn't allow for coming home reliably, so I stopped doing it." A long pause. "I've been reading about what units like yours do," Elara said. "The operations, the environments." She paused. "You gave that up." "I gave up that version of my life." He moved away from the window and sat down at the kitchen table, which still had Tessa's homework on it from the previous night. A math worksheet with a drawing of a horse in the margin that was, objectively, also a potato, though he would never say that. "I built a different one." "Do you miss it?" It was the question people always wanted to ask and rarely did, because they could see from the outside that the answer was complicated and they didn't want to be responsible for the complication. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "not the specific operations, the clarity. When you're in that work, everything unnecessary falls away. You know exactly what matters and what doesn't." He paused. "When I came home, when I left, everything got complicated again. Good complicated, the complicated of a real life. But it took adjusting." "Is that why you took the job at Asterion?" "Partly. I needed work." He considered how honest to be and decided that the conversation had already crossed the threshold past which partial honesty was a form of dishonesty. "And partly because I walked into that building and saw something that needed to be addressed, and I couldn't walk past it. That instinct, I don't think I get to turn it off. I'm not sure I'd want to." "You could have just told Dale and walked out." "Yes." "But you didn't." "No." Another silence. He had the impression that she was somewhere in her office. He'd learned to read her silences against their backgrounds, the quality of the quiet that came from her being alone in a large space. "The federal investigators told me about your record in fragments," she said. "Pieces here and there, enough to understand the scale of it without the specifics." She paused. "One of them, the agent at the hangar who recognized you, he said something I keep thinking about." "What did he say?" "He said the people in your unit were selected for 2 things, technical capability and judgment. He said the judgment was rarer. He said you could teach almost anyone the technical elements given enough time, but the judgment, the capacity to read a situation correctly under conditions where being wrong was fatal, was something you either had or you didn't." A pause. "He said in 10 years of serving adjacent to your unit, he never saw you read a situation wrong." He was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about all the times he'd been less certain than that assessment implied, all the hours in bad positions where he'd been operating on probability rather than certainty, and had simply been lucky enough for the probability to resolve correctly. "He's being generous," Ronan said. He seemed like someone who chose his words carefully. He wasn't present for every situation. No, but he was present for some of them. She paused. "Ronan, why didn't you tell me? Even in general terms, even just, this is who I used to be." He thought about how to answer this and found the honest answer more quickly than he'd expected. "Because I wasn't trying to impress you. And because who I used to be isn't who I am anymore. Being her father, that's who I am. The rest is context." He stopped. "I didn't want the history to be the thing you were responding to. I wanted whatever evaluation you were making to be based on what you were actually seeing." Elara was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology for something else," she said. "You don't owe me. I told you, the night I hired you, that I had 3 other candidates with cleaner resumes. I implied that you were a compromise. I said it as a negotiating position, and it was condescending." A pause. "You were the only person in that interview group who looked at my building instead of their reflection in my building's windows. I knew that within 20 minutes. He didn't say anything. "I'm also calling," she said with a shift in tone that he recognized as the sound of someone who has finished the harder part of a conversation and is moving to the practical because the practical is slightly easier to stand on. "Because I'd like to meet with you when you're available. Not for the investigation, that has its own process. For a different conversation about Asterion and about what I'm planning to do with it going forward." "I'm listening," he said. "Not on the phone," she said. "I'd rather do this in person. Somewhere that isn't a federal building or my office, because I've spent enough time in both of those spaces recently." A brief pause. "And I thought, if Tessa isn't in school on Saturday morning, that you might both want to see the space. Asterion has a courtyard on the east side of the main building that most of the executive staff don't use because it looks like it might have once had a garden in it, and now it just looks like it's thinking about it. That's an unusual description of a courtyard. Tessa might appreciate the ambiguity." Another pause, and this one had something different in it, something slightly careful. "I realize that might be overstepping." "It's not," he said. "She'd probably diagnose the garden situation immediately. I was counting on that." A beat. "Saturday morning, if that works." Saturday morning works. He took Tessa on Saturday morning. She wore the yellow jacket and the too large backpack out of habit, even though he told her she didn't need it, and she asked 4 questions in the truck that covered the topics of where they were going, why they were going there, whether there would be horses, and whether the woman they were going to see was the boss from before. "Yes," he said to the last one, "the one with the greenhouse building." "The same one." Tessa processed this. "I liked her," she said, as though this were a matter she'd given considerable additional thought since the first meeting and had arrived at the same conclusion. "You met her for 90 seconds. I told you." She answered my questions seriously. She looked out the window. "Adults who answer questions seriously are rare. You should keep track of them." He drove. The Asterion courtyard was on the east side of the main building, accessible through a glass corridor that connected to the lobby. It was exactly as Elara had described, a rectangular space with stone paving and raised planters that had clearly once contained something intentional and now contained the determined remnants of whatever had self-seeded since. The morning light came over the east building in a way that made the neglected planters look more poetic than abandoned. Elara was already there when they arrived, sitting at one of the stone benches with a coffee in each hand, and a third cup on the bench beside her that Ronan registered as being considerably smaller and sealed with a lid. "Hot chocolate," she told Tessa, offering it. "I guessed, because it's what I would have wanted at your age." Tessa accepted it with both hands and the grave courtesy of someone receiving something correctly identified. "Thank you." She looked at the courtyard. "This used to have a garden." "Yes, about 6 years ago." "What happened to it?" "Nobody tended it. It turned into whatever it is now." Tessa walked to the nearest planter and looked at it carefully. "Some of this is still growing. It just looks wrong because nothing is guiding it." She looked back at Elara. "If you put in some structure, it would probably come back." Elara looked at the planter, then at Tessa, with an expression that Ronan recognized. It was the same expression from the first meeting, the one of being recalibrated. I'll consider that. Tessa accepted this and moved to explore the rest of the courtyard, keeping within visible range with the habitual care of a child who had learned what distances were acceptable without being told in explicit terms. Ronan sat on the bench. Elara handed him the second coffee. "She's extraordinary," Elara said, watching Tessa peer into a planter at the far end. "She's 7 and she has opinions about everything." "That's what I mean." She held her coffee in both hands. "I've been thinking about what you said. On the phone. About clarity." She paused. "I think I've been running Asterion in a way that optimized for everything except the thing that actually mattered. I was managing the board, managing the optics, managing the acquisition conversations, managing Victor." She stopped. "I spent 4 months being managed by a situation instead of being honest about what the situation was." "You were trying to protect the company," he said. "I was protecting my position in the company. There's a difference, and I knew it at the time." She looked at the courtyard. What they were building, the campaign against me, it worked partly because they understood that I valued the appearance of control too much to admit when I'd lost it. They exploited that. A pause. "I should have told the federal investigators everything I suspected about Victor the moment I suspected it. I waited because I was afraid of what acknowledging it would cost me. If you'd moved too early and the evidence wasn't there, Victor could have turned it around on you." "That's the rational explanation. I'm not entirely sure it was the actual reason." She turned and looked at him directly. "I also should have told you sooner. Everything I knew. You were working with partial information for weeks, and it put you in a position of having to build the picture from the outside when I had pieces of it from the inside." He thought about the evidence package he'd spent 2 nights assembling, about the pieces that had taken him longer than they should have because information he'd needed had been withheld not from him specifically, but from the situation in general. "It worked out," he said. "It worked out because you're very good at working with partial information." She turned back toward the courtyard. "I want to do this differently. All of it." A pause. "I'm reorganizing Asterion's security function. Entirely. Not a cosmetic change, the culture that allowed Victor and the others to operate inside the company for that long, without anyone raising a flag, isn't a structural problem. It's a people and incentive problem. People weren't trained to see manipulation. They were trained to see performance metrics and not ask questions that made senior executives uncomfortable." "That describes a lot of organizations," Ronan said. "I don't want to run that organization anymore." She held her coffee. "I want to build a security division that operates on the principle that seeing something real matters more than reporting something comfortable. And I want someone to lead it who understands the difference in their bones." She looked at him. "I'm aware this is a significant ask. I'm aware your previous role was defined by a scope that you're already outside of. And I'm aware that you have a primary obligation, Tessa," he said, "which is non-negotiable." "Yes. I'm not asking you to compromise that. I'm asking whether there's a version of this work, with the scope and the hours and the structure, that would allow you to do both." She paused. "And I'm asking that honestly, not as a recruiting pitch. If the honest answer is no, I'd rather know that now." He looked at the courtyard. Tessa was crouching near the far planter, examining something at ground level with the focus of a field biologist. She picked up what looked like a small piece of broken terracotta and turned it over in her hands. He had been asking himself this question, in some form or another, since the morning he'd sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Paulson's cancellation text and made the decision to bring Tessa to an interview. He'd been asking it every time his work had pulled him past the hour he was supposed to be home, every time he'd watched her asleep on Mrs. Paulson's couch and calculated what the job was costing them. But he'd also been asking it differently since the hangar. Since the moment he'd stood outside the facility gate with federal agents moving past him and had thought, that's what this was ever actually for. Not the operation, not the outcome. The image of Tessa throwing a tennis ball in Garrett's backyard, unaware, safe. "I need certain things," he said. "Tell me. A schedule that I can plan around. I can work long hours when the situation requires it. I can't have my baseline schedule be unpredictable. She's 7 and she needs to know when I'm going to be home." He paused. "Authority to make decisions without running every judgment call up a chain. Not because I don't want oversight, because good security work requires the latitude to act on what you see in real time. Done. I need to build the team myself, from the hiring criteria to the training protocols. If I'm accountable for the outcome, I have to be accountable for who's doing the work. Yes. And I need honest information. Everything relevant that you have, when you have it, not when you've decided it's the right time or the comfortable time. He held her gaze. If we're doing this, I'm not working with partial information again. She met his eyes steadily. Agreed. She paused. Anything else? He thought about it. One more thing. What? He nodded toward Tessa, who had found another piece of terracotta and was now arranging them in a row along the planter's edge with the systematic focus of someone with a plan. If she's going to be around this building, and I have a feeling she's going to want to be because she's already decided the courtyard needs work, and I recognize that look. She gets to do the courtyard garden if she wants to. No executive approval required. She picks what goes in it. Elara looked at Tessa. Something in her expression did the thing again. The recalibration, a warmth that was different from her professional warmth, less managed. I think that's the best proposal anyone has brought to me this year, she said. Tessa, from across the courtyard, held up a piece of terracotta. This is shaped like a horse, she called. They both looked. It was shaped like a potato. It is, Elara said seriously. Tessa nodded, satisfied, and placed it carefully at the end of her row. Ronan held his coffee with both hands and felt the morning light come over the east building and settle on the stone paving and the neglected planters, and the small, methodical figure arranging broken pieces into something that had its own logic, its own order, and the particular dignity of a child who was entirely confident in her own perception of the world. He thought about the life he'd left, about the clarity of that life, the way everything unnecessary fell away. He thought about what had replaced it, the complicated, necessary, irreplaceable weight of this one, with its scrambled eggs at 9 p.m. and horse drawings that looked like potatoes and babysitters, who canceled, and pipes under sinks, and a 7-year-old who cataloged the world with his own eyes and didn't seem to find it wanting. He thought about what Garrett had said on the phone, the night it was over. Don't sit on it trying to manage it alone. He wasn't alone at this table. He was aware of that. He didn't say any of this out loud. Some things didn't need to be said to be true. And this one was true in the way that the morning light was true. Not because anyone had argued for it, but simply because it was there, present, undeniable, falling equally on everything it touched. Across the courtyard, Tessa found one more piece and placed it at the beginning of her row, adjusting the angle twice before she was satisfied. It needs something in the middle, she announced. Something taller. We'll find something, Elara said. Tessa considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Okay, she said, and went back to her assessment. The trial of Victor Sloan opened on a Tuesday in February, 8 months after the night at the hangar, and Ronan did not attend the opening proceedings because he had a staff training session scheduled that morning that 17 people were depending on, and because watching Victor walk into a courtroom was not something he needed to see to feel the weight of its meaning. He read about it that evening on his phone at the kitchen table while Tessa did her homework across from him, her pencil moving in the particular rhythm she had when she was working on something she understood, steady, unhurried, occasionally stopping to erase and correct with the calm practicality of someone who knew that errors were part of the process and not an occasion for distress. He had tried to teach her that. He wasn't sure how much of it was teaching and how much was simply who she was. The news coverage of Victor's arraignment was thorough and, in the way of news coverage, slightly off in its emphasis. It led with the corporate drama of Asterion, the boardroom conspiracy, the CEO who had refused to capitulate, and treated the human elements of the story as color rather than substance. Victor's photograph ran alongside Elara's, and the article described Ronan as a security consultant with a classified military background, which was accurate in the same way that describing the Pacific Ocean as a large body of water was accurate. He set the phone down. You're doing it again, Tessa said without looking up. Doing what? The thing where you look at something, and then you look away, and then you have a different face. She erased something on her worksheet. You've been doing it more lately. I didn't know it was a thing. It's definitely a thing. She looked up. Is it the work stuff? The work stuff is mostly resolved. Mostly isn't all the way. He looked at her. She was 8 now, had turned 8 in November, and the party had been small because that was how she wanted it. Just Garrett's family and Mrs. Paulson, and for the first time Elara, who had arrived with a gift that turned out to be a set of professional drawing pencils in 24 grades and a book about horse anatomy that Tessa had carried around for a week like a primary text. The age had not dramatically changed her, but it had sharpened the edges of the person she was already clearly becoming. More direct, more willing to name what she observed, less interested in the diplomatic fiction that adults sometimes preferred. "The work stuff is mostly resolved," he said again. "The rest is legal proceedings that don't require me to do anything except occasionally give written statements." "Okay." She went back to her worksheet. "And the other thing?" "What other thing?" She gave him a look that was remarkably similar to the one he gave her when she tried to claim she'd already brushed her teeth. "The Elara thing." He was quiet for a moment. "What Elara thing?" "Dad." She set her pencil down. "She comes here for dinner and you make actual food instead of scrambled eggs. That's a thing." She picked the pencil back up. "I don't mind. She laughs at your jokes, which is generous." "My jokes are good." "Your jokes are very specific and not everyone follows them." She erased something. "She follows them, I noticed." He looked at the table. Tessa's worksheet had, in its top margin, a small drawing of a horse that looked objectively more like a horse than any of her previous attempts. The lessons Elara had been giving her, not formally, just at the kitchen table on evenings when she stayed for dinner, sketching alongside her, showing her how proportion worked, were visible in the drawing in a way that made something in his chest do a thing he didn't entirely have vocabulary for. "You're not bothered by it," he said. It was not quite a question. Tessa looked up. "Why would I be?" "Some kids are. Some kids have different situations." She said this with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had been in enough school environments and playdates to have observed the range of family configurations that existed. "I like her. She takes my opinions seriously." A pause. "She also told me that the courtyard project needed a budget and then she actually made one. Nobody usually makes actual budgets when I suggest things." "You suggested a budget?" "I did research. Plants cost money." She returned to her worksheet. "I presented a proposal." He had not known about the proposal. He made a note to ask Elara about this, and then made a further note that the fact of his not having known that Tessa had presented a proposal to Elara, and Elara had responded to it, and this had happened between the two of them without routing through him, did not feel like something to be alarmed by. It felt like something settling into a shape he hadn't designed but recognized. He had started the new role at Asterion in October, 6 weeks after the Saturday morning in the courtyard. He had spent September doing the thing he'd told Elara he needed to do first, designing the hiring criteria. Not job descriptions in the HR sense, criteria in the operational sense. The qualities that made a person genuinely capable of identifying threat patterns before they became disasters, of maintaining clear judgment under pressure, of communicating what they saw rather than what the people above them wanted to hear. It was harder to define than it sounded, because the qualities that made someone good at this work were mostly qualities that didn't appear on resumes. You couldn't list instinct as a credential. You couldn't quantify the particular kind of intellectual honesty that allowed a person to say, "I don't know," in a situation where saying "I know" would have been professionally easier. He'd had to build a hiring process that was unusual enough to surface those qualities in people who had them and had never been asked to demonstrate them in an interview room. He'd run the first round of candidates through a facility tour. Elara had understood immediately why he'd chosen that format and hadn't questioned it. She'd simply ensured the tour route contained 3 deliberate anomalies and then reviewed his notes on what each candidate had observed. 2 of the 12 candidates had flagged all 3 anomalies without being prompted. He hired both of them on the same day. He also hired 4 others who had flagged 1 or 2 anomalies, but whose instincts he'd assessed during the debrief conversations as genuine rather than performative. People who hadn't seen all 3 things, but had seen something real, and more importantly had been honest about the limits of their observation. That honesty mattered more than the count. You could develop the skill of observation with training. You couldn't develop the habit of honest reporting in someone who didn't already value it. The team was 11 people by February, including Ronan, and they operated under a reporting structure that went directly to Elara rather than through intermediate management, because intermediate management was where uncomfortable observations went to become comfortable before they reached the top. That had been a structural condition of his taking the role, and Elara had agreed to it without extended negotiation, which told him the lesson of Victor had landed somewhere deep. Training was the other element. He ran sessions twice a week. each one built around a real scenario from Asterion's own recent history, sanitized of identifying details, presented as case studies, because the most effective way to teach people to recognize manipulation was to show them manipulation they had already failed to recognize and let them work backward through why. This was uncomfortable. It was supposed to be uncomfortable. The people in those sessions had worked in a building where a coordinated conspiracy operated for months, and they had not seen it, and sitting with that fact was not pleasant. But sitting with it was how you ensured you'd see the next one. Dale Pittman attended the first 3 training sessions, and then, on the 4th, began leading sections of them himself. This was not something Ronan had asked for or engineered. Dale had simply made the decision that the curriculum was right, and that his role in it was to contribute rather than observe. Ronan found this useful and said so, which Dale acknowledged with a silence of the duration that meant he considered the matter settled. What Ronan had not anticipated, and what constituted the most significant practical education of the first several months, was the cultural resistance, not from the security team, which was too new to have encrusted habits, but from the broader organization. From executives who had been at Asterion for years and who experienced the new security protocols as an assertion that they had previously been insufficient, which was accurate and which they found uncomfortable. From middle management who resented the direct reporting line to Elara as an end run around their authority. From employees who had been habituated to the old culture, the one that didn't ask uncomfortable questions, and who found the new one slightly threatening. He handled these things case by case, with the patience of someone who understood that institutional change moved at the speed of the slowest convincible person, not the fastest converted one. He did not argue with the resistance. He documented incidents where the new protocols caught something the old system would have missed, and he presented those incidents at staff meetings without editorializing, and he let the evidence do what evidence did when it was allowed to speak clearly. By December, the resistance had become quieter. By February, 2 of the 3 previously resistant executives had requested meetings to discuss expanding the training protocols to their own departments. This was not a victory he celebrated, because celebrating that kind of shift was a good way to undermine the collegial relationship you'd just managed to build. He acknowledged it, incorporated it, and moved on. Elara watched all of this with the attention of someone who was learning something she hadn't known she needed to learn. He saw it in the way she asked questions in their weekly briefings. The questions were changing, becoming more specific, more interested in the mechanisms of why people saw or failed to see what was in front of them. She was not simply accepting his reports, she was building her own understanding of the operational logic behind them. He found this privately more impressive than most things he'd encountered in any professional context. He also found it difficult to be fully objective about, which was information he acknowledged and kept separate from his professional assessments. The thing between them, the thing Tessa had named with the directness of an 8-year-old who found euphemism a waste of everyone's time, had developed the way things developed when 2 people were being careful about it without discussing that they were being careful. Slowly, without announced stages, in the way that a plant grows, which is to say, not dramatically from day to day, but unmistakably from where you started to where you are. It had been, at its beginning, the mutual trust built under genuine pressure. The kind of trust that forms in situations where being wrong about a person has serious consequences and you choose to trust them anyway, and they turn out to be worth it. That kind of trust was different from the trust that developed in ordinary circumstances. It didn't require the same duration. It had been tested in conditions that normal relationships never faced in their entire span. But trust and the other thing were not the same thing, and the other thing had taken longer, had required the pressure to be absent, or at least reduced, before it could grow clearly enough to name. The first time he'd understood what it was, not suspected, but understood, was in November, a week before Tessa's birthday. He and Elara had been working late in her office, going over the annual security assessment, which was a document that required both of them because it covered operational elements that only he fully understood and strategic implications that only she could evaluate. They'd been working for 3 hours, and the building had emptied around them, and at some point someone had brought coffee that had gone cold. She'd been reading something in the document, and she'd laughed. Not a professional laugh, not the controlled amusement she deployed in meetings, but an actual laugh, surprised out of her by something in his phrasing. "What?" he'd said. She'd read the sentence back to him. It was a description of a near incident in the parking structure during a contractor visit in October, a situation that had resolved without consequence, but that had required one of his team members to make a very fast decision in a very small window. In his account of it, he'd written the decision-making process with the clinical clarity of an incident report, and then, apparently without registering it as unusual, had added one sentence. The outcome was positive. The contractor looked alarmed. Both of these were appropriate. "You have a sense of humor in your incident reports," she'd said, still with the genuine laugh in her voice. "It's not a sense of humor. It's an accurate description. It's definitely also a sense of humor." He'd looked at her. The late hour, the empty building, the cold coffee, the laugh that was still there in her eyes. And he'd had the experience of understanding something he'd been avoiding understanding for some time. He hadn't said anything, neither had she. But something had settled in the room, a different kind of quiet, and they'd gone back to the document, and the document was the same document it had been an hour ago, but something was different about being in the room with it. He'd told Garrett about it the following weekend, obliquely, while they were standing in Garrett's garage looking at a repair Garrett was halfway through on his own truck. "She laughed at something I wrote," Ronan said. Garrett handed him a wrench without looking up. "About time. I didn't say anything to her." Also noted. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "This isn't a situation I have a lot of experience navigating." "You navigated a guy with a remote fuel manifold. That's different." "It really isn't." Garrett finally looked up. "The reason that was less difficult is because you knew what you were doing and you'd trained for it. You haven't trained for this. Doesn't mean you can't do it." He took the wrench back. "It means you're going to be less certain than you're comfortable with and you're going to do it anyway." He'd thought about this for several weeks. And then one evening in late January, on a night when Tessa was at a sleepover at a classmate's house, and the house was quiet in the specific way it only got when she wasn't in it. Slightly too large, all the usual sounds slightly too audible, he'd called Elara. She'd answered quickly, the way she did in the evenings, without the professional preparation her daytime calls carried. "I want to take you to dinner," he said. "Not a work dinner, not a briefing." He paused. "An actual dinner." A silence. Brief. He counted 2 seconds. "Okay," she said. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. It was not a complicated conversation, but it was the right one, and he was aware of this when he hung up, and he was aware of it again on Saturday when he drove to the restaurant, a place Garrett's wife Dana had suggested, which was Dana's way of ensuring that neither of them would be in a situation where the choice of location became a source of unnecessary stress. And when Elara was there before him, which she usually was, and when the evening was not perfectly smooth in the way that evenings were never perfectly smooth when they actually mattered. He said the wrong thing twice. She misread what he meant once and had to ask him to restate it, which he did. The bread at this particular restaurant was good, and they both agreed on this without making it a bigger moment than it was. He told her about a training session that had not gone the way he'd planned and what he'd learned from its failure. She told him about a board restructuring conversation that had been ugly in ways that the eventual outcome didn't fully capture. He told her about something Tessa had said at breakfast that week that had been so precisely and accidentally insightful that he'd written it down. "What did she say?" Elara asked. "She said that the problem with most people wasn't that they were bad at noticing things. The problem was that they noticed things and then talked themselves out of what they noticed because it was inconvenient." He paused. "She was talking about a girl in her class. But," Elara looked at him, "she's 8. "I know." "Did you write it down in an incident report?" "I wrote it in a notebook." She smiled. And he looked at the smile and thought about what Garrett had said, that he was going to be less certain than he was comfortable with and he was going to do it anyway. And he decided, with the particular quality of decision that came from accepting uncertainty rather than waiting for it to resolve, that this was right. Not certain. Right. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right. This matters to me. However you want to proceed with it. I'm not managing an outcome. I'm telling you what's true." She held his gaze. She did the thing she did where she was very still for a moment, the signal that she was not reflexively responding, but actually considering. "It matters to me too," she said. "That's not a surprise to either of us." "No. But you're saying it out loud because saying things out loud is how I know I'm not managing them," he said. I have a tendency to manage situations internally until I've resolved them into something I can present cleanly. It's a habit from work. He paused. This isn't something I want to manage, so I'm saying it out loud while it's still complicated. She looked at him for a moment longer. It's still complicated, she agreed, and I'm glad you said it. They split the check, which was not something she preferred. He saw the slight hesitation before she accepted it, and he drove home through streets that were cold and clear, in the way of late January nights that have given up on precipitation and committed to just being cold, and he sat in his truck in the driveway for a moment before going inside. He thought, you spent years being afraid that the life you were building wasn't enough, that surviving the other life had cost you the capacity for this one. He thought, you were wrong about that. He went inside and turned on the kitchen light and looked at the refrigerator with its magnets and drawings, and the counter with its evidence of a life that was small in square footage and large in everything that the square footage couldn't measure. And he felt, not happiness in the simple sense, which he'd always found an insufficient word for a complicated state, but something more like the sensation of being in the right place at the right time for the right reasons. He thought about a thing his commanding officer had told him once, years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with this context, but that he'd carried anyway, because the good observations traveled across situations. He'd said, the most dangerous assumption a trained person makes is that the skills which got them here are the skills they need from here forward. They're not the same skills. The mission changes. The mission had changed, had been changing since Tessa was 4 years old and needed someone to come home, and he'd understood what that required of him and had made the choice. And then it had changed again, quietly, in the courtyard of a building where the planters were beginning to show real growth, because Tessa had researched the right soil amendments and presented a proposal with a budget, and because someone had taken the proposal seriously and implemented it. The mission, he understood now, was not any individual thing. It was not protecting one person, or building one team, or healing one broken institution, or raising one child. It was the continuous choosing of the people and the work and the life that were worth being present for. It was simple, and it was the hardest work he'd ever done. The Security Training Center opened on a Thursday in March. It occupied the east wing of Asterian's main building, the wing that had been used for storage and the overflow from departments that had accumulated material faster than they'd organized it. It had taken 2 months of renovation to turn it into something functional, and the renovation had not gone entirely smoothly, which was appropriate because most things worth building didn't. Ronan had not designed it to look impressive. He'd designed it to work. There were rooms for scenario training, spaces that could be reconfigured to simulate different environments, different access control problems, different threat patterns. There was a documentation center where every significant security incident from Asterian's past 3 years had been cataloged and analyzed and made available as case study material. There was a wall. This had been Tessa's suggestion, offered with the seriousness of someone who had thought it through, on which the core principles of the program were written in letters large enough to read from across the room, not as a decorative element, but as a reminder available every time someone walked through the door. Tessa had helped choose which principles made the wall. She had been extremely selective. There were 4. The first was, see what's there, not what you expect. The second, honest observation is more valuable than comfortable reporting. The third, the pattern matters more than any single event. The fourth, which was Tessa's contribution and which Ronan had not expected and had not amended. The person in front of you knows something you don't. That one needs some context, he'd told her when she'd proposed it. No, it doesn't, she'd said. If you have to explain it, it's not doing the job. He had put it on the wall. The opening was small by design. No press, no catered event, no speeches from executives who wanted to be associated with a successful initiative. Just the security team and a handful of staff from across the company who had been particularly engaged in the training program, and Elara, and Garrett, and Dana, who had driven down for it, because Garrett had said he wanted to see what Ronan had built, and Dana had said she wanted to see Tessa's wall, and neither of them had taken no for an answer. Tessa stood in front of the wall for a long time, reading the 4 principles with the expression of someone doing quality control. Then she nodded, once, satisfied. The letters are slightly uneven on the third one, she told the contractor who'd done the installation. The contractor looked at the wall. I don't see it. Third line, second word. The spacing is tighter than the rest. She pointed without touching. It's fine, but you should look at it. The contractor looked at it again. Then he got slightly closer. Then he said quietly, "Huh." Ronan watched this exchange from across the room and thought about what it meant that his 8-year-old daughter had, in the span of 30 seconds, demonstrated all 4 principles on the wall simultaneously. She'd seen what was there rather than what was expected. She'd reported it honestly, regardless of whether it was comfortable. She'd identified the specific deviation from the pattern, and she'd assumed the contractor would want to know, that he knew something worth being told. He did not say this out loud because saying it out loud would have made it smaller. Elara came to stand beside him. She'd seen it too. He could tell from the way she was looking at Tessa. The expression wasn't the recalibration expression anymore, that had given way, over months, to something that had fewer layers, something more direct. She looked at Tessa the way you looked at a person you had decided mattered to you. "She's going to run something someday," Elara said quietly. "She's going to critique the spacing on the sign of whatever she's running. And the thing will be better for it." He looked at Elara. She was looking at Tessa. He had the thought, not for the first time, but with a clarity it hadn't always had, that the life he was standing in had not been designed. He had not planned for any of this specific configuration of people and work and courtyard gardens and principal walls and dinners where he said the wrong thing and was corrected and corrected himself, and dinner continued. He had made one decision, to come home, to be present, and everything else had grown from that, in the direction that things grew when you tended them honestly without insisting on the shape. "Ronan," Elara said. "Yeah. Last week. When you said it out loud." She was still looking at Tessa. "I wanted to say something back, but I didn't know how to say it without it sounding managed," he said. "Managed," she agreed. She turned and looked at him. "It's not managed. I want you to know that." A pause. "This is the most unmanaged I've been in several years. It's a little uncomfortable." "I know. I'm not complaining. I know that too." She held his gaze for a moment, and the something between them that had been building since a lobby and a facility tour, and 3 observations in 11 minutes, and a parking structure, and a photograph, and a drainage channel. All that accumulated weight of specific moments that had made them trust each other before they'd had any other reason to, sat in the air between them like a decision that had already been made, one that only needed time to finish making itself. "Okay," she said. It meant more than the word itself. He understood that. Across the room, Garrett was making the contractor look at the 3rd line again. Dana was standing next to Tessa explaining something about the spacing that Tessa was listening to with full attention. The rest of the team was moving through the space, looking at things, talking in the low voices of people in a room that meant something to them. The executives who had once watched Ronan arrive in worn boots to an interview he had no business being in now worked under training protocols he had built. And the 3 of them who had actively resisted those protocols had, over the course of several months, come around to something that, if not quite enthusiasm, was at least genuine engagement, which was more than he'd expected and enough to work with. The investigation was in its final phase. Victor Sloan had entered a guilty plea in February, the comprehensive nature of the evidence having apparently persuaded him that the trial's outcome was not genuinely in question. The 3 board members were in various stages of plea proceedings. The acquisition firm's principals were fighting harder, as entities that had operated behind multiple corporate layers and whose direct culpability required more intricate prosecution tended to do, but Samuels had told him in January that the case was solid and that she expected resolution before the end of the year. Elara had restructured the board. The replacements were not dramatic departures. They were not reformers or crusaders. They were competent people who understood that their role was oversight rather than pressure, which was a distinction the previous 3 members had apparently never grasped or had chosen to ignore. The new board had voted unanimously at its first meeting to retain Asterian's defense division and to increase investment in its development. The company was not healed. That was the honest assessment. Institutions didn't heal the way individuals did. The damage wasn't located in one place, didn't respond to a single treatment, didn't have a clear recovery timeline. What they had was a different culture taking root alongside the old one, growing in the available space, and the question of which eventually dominated was a question that would be answered over years, not months. He was comfortable with that. He understood how slow growth worked. He had learned it from a courtyard. Tessa came to find him when the contractor had gone and Dana had moved on to examining the training room configurations. "The fourth one is my favorite," she said. "I know it's yours. But it's also actually the most important." She looked up at him. "The person in front of you knows something you don't. That should be the first thing everyone learns." "Why first?" She considered this with the seriousness she gave to actual questions. "Because if you don't believe that, nothing else works. You walk in already thinking you know more than they do, and then you miss everything they could tell you." She paused. "You taught me that. By doing it, not by saying it." He looked at his daughter. She was wearing the yellow jacket, not the original, which she'd outgrown, but a new one that was technically the same color and that she'd selected herself from 3 options Dana had helped her look at. Not because Dana had been tasked with this, but because Tessa had asked, and Dana had said yes, and this was how things worked now. She was standing in a room he'd built at a company where the person he was building something else with stood 20 feet away discussing logistics with Dale, and the wall behind her had 4 principles on it, one of which she'd written, and the contractor had gone home to look at his spacing on every sign he'd installed this month. He put his hand on her shoulder. "You did good on the wall," he said. She leaned into his side. "You did good on all of it." He thought about what it meant. All of it. The long accumulation of days since he'd made the decision to leave the other life. The days that had been hard, and the days that had been ordinary, and the days that had been both. The scrambled eggs at 9 p.m., the horses that looked like potatoes, the pipes under sinks, and the babysitters who canceled, and the mornings he'd driven her to school and felt the specific weight of being the only anchor in a life that needed one. The wearing boots that needed resoling. He had spent years afraid that leaving the thing he was trained for meant he had left the thing he was for. That the man who could walk into a building and see in 11 minutes what nobody else in the room had seen was the real version, and the man making scrambled eggs was the diminished one, the one in retreat, the one managing a loss. He understood now that he'd had it backward. The man making scrambled eggs was not the diminished version. He was the version that the other one had been pointed toward all along. The destination the years of hard work and difficult living had been trying to arrive at. The trained instinct, the classified record, the capacity for judgment under pressure. All of that had been real, had mattered, had been worth the cost of acquiring it. But its highest use had not been in any of the operations it had served. Its highest use was here, seeing clearly what was in front of him, reporting honestly what he found, and choosing, every day, the people and the work that were worth being present for. That was not a diminishment, that was everything. Elara crossed the room and came to stand on his other side. Not close enough to be formal, close enough to be what it was. "The contractor is coming back next week to fix the spacing," she said. "She found it in 30 seconds, Ronan said. "I know, I watched." She looked at the wall. "The 4th principle. When she proposed it, I was going to suggest we word it differently. I thought it was too simple." "What changed your mind?" "I kept thinking about it, and I couldn't improve it." A pause. The simplest accurate statement is usually the right one. Tessa, who had been listening with the specific quality of a child who pretends not to be listening, said, "Thank you," without turning around. Elara smiled. Not the professional one. Outside, through the windows at the end of the training center corridor, the March light was doing what March light did in this part of the world, trying inconsistently to become something warmer than it currently was, occasionally succeeding. The courtyard, visible from the east-facing windows, had the first real growth of the season in its planters. Not dramatic, not the full recovery it was working toward, but present, undeniable, pushing up through soil that had been neglected for 6 years, and then, finally, attended to. The story that had begun with a man in worn boots noticing 3 things in 11 minutes and deciding to say so. That story had its formal ending in courtrooms and federal case files and board resolutions, and signed organizational restructuring documents. It had the kind of ending that could be summarized in a news article or a legal filing or a corporate press release. But the other ending, the one that wasn't in any document, that didn't have a date or a case number or an official record, was here, in a room with 4 principles on a wall, with a child who had written one of them, and a woman who had almost improved it, and a man who understood, finally and without remaining doubt, that surviving dangerous things had never been his achievement. Building something worth surviving for had been. The mission was not over,